There's zeal in his heart, fire in his eyes. May it burn away the trust and lay bare the lies. Fill my heart with fire, the same fire that's in your eyes. I'm riveted by your glow and the burning that's light.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Refining Exegetics, a podcast and biblical studies channel which aims to inspire life-changing interpretations of the Bible and our stories through unique explorations of modern biblical scholarship and ancient wisdom. As always, I'm your host, Jared Kasperi. And tonight's live stream will be another segment, the second segment of what I'd like to call Torah Tuesdays. This is a segment that I'll be running, hopefully in conjunction with the channel Teach Yahweh, Kenisha. We did a live stream last Tuesday together. She's not available to be on this time, but she is streaming this to her channel as well as being streamed to mine. So, and what the purpose of this is to really dive deeper through a live stream presentation and panel discussions to really dig into the questions concerning the Apostle Paul and what he taught in his first century context in regards to the law of Moses, in regards to justification. And part of the reason for that is presentation-wise, I'm presenting a viewpoint and a reading of Paul that would be considered within scholarship to be like the Paul within Judaism trajectory of scholarship, and as opposed to, say, Catholic or say Reformed Protestant readings of Paul, which sort of then around the mid 19th or mid 20th century, a big paradigm shift began to happen in scholarship, and that kind of led into what would be called the new perspective on Paul, and then sort of recognizing some of the deficiencies of that reading that didn't account for all the data that we've been discovering through increasing knowledge and understanding of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and just getting better at doing scholarship regarding Paul. That's sort of led into a reading of Paul where he stayed within Judaism proper, recognizing that there were different sects, different Pharisaic sects, different sects, sectarian groups within Judaism of the day. And some of the issues that were intra-Jewish, Paul was right in the fray of that. And as opposed to like departing from Judaism and starting something completely different. So that's sort of where we're at. We introduced that topic. I sort of introduced 4 principles, fundamental principles, to serve as a way of fundamentally understanding Paul's discourse, his polemics, especially regarding negative polemics regarding like terms like law and works of law, and I put forth an understanding that's basically within Paul within Judaism scholarship, where works of law, this ergon nomu, is a term that is a technical term referencing a specific set of halakhic regulations that are basically are equivalent to what Jesus spoke of in places like Mark 7, where he excoriates some of the Pharisees for holding to the tradition of the elders, and in so doing neglecting whether it be weighty matters of the actual law or actually just totally setting aside commandments of God because they have these things and these are the standard. when you've invented your own standard, and you make that the focus and sort of your community identity that are revolve around those regulations, it's very easy to slip into setting aside actual commandments, um, and uh, it will turn out that these regulations end up being less than what the actual commandments require, and leading you into a righteousness of your own, as opposed to righteousness that God actually reveals through his law and that we're meant to walk in. So, and immediately after that, where we got into discussion was immediately into places like Galatians 3:10. That's understandable. I'm quite prepared for that, and we had a lively discussion in regards to what works of law was primarily meaning. There was a lot of pushback saying that works of law, and people prefer to just keep saying works of the law, even though works of the law is not a an actual phrase in the Bible. It's just ergon nomu, works of law. Many people still hold to that idea that that's actually in reference to trying to do the law, the actual commandments of the law of Moses. And but when I want to bring forth some exegetical points from some scholarly sources uh, to really I want to push back on some of those traditional readings, and just I want to get people to see defamiliarize themselves with this term works of law, coming out of a traditional Reformed Protestant tradition, and step into the first century and what actually we have uh, evidence for to lead uh, Paul's phrase works of law to be actually pertaining to sectarian halakhic regulations. And so that's what we're going to jump into here. And then I hope that we'll, as I bring forth, read a little bit of this, and then we'll open up the panel. I'll pin the StreamYard link to the chat and to open up the panel, and we can maybe continue the discussion. Those of you who were on the panel last Tuesday, I definitely want welcome you to come back up, and we can continue a conversation, as well as new people who are able to join. So when we get to that point, I'll get that going. So let's see. I want to make sure I don't want to forget anything. Wow, the chat's already going crazy. Awesome. And just again, many who have seen my face of late on live streams we're not talking about the Trinity. We're not going to be talking at all about Trinity versus Trinitarian versus Unitarianism, or even questions like, can you lose your salvation? Those questions I'm just not concerned about, and I just if people would respect what the topic is and would stick to that, not come on and start saying weird off the wall arguments and emotionalism and stuff like that. Let's leave that at the door, so we can come sit at the table and have meaningful conversation together. All right. Let's see. Good evening, Kanisha, Teach Yahweh, bless you, shalom. Let's see. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of stuff about Jesus being God in the chat. Let's not let's stay on topic, folks. The question that we're going to be talking about is, we're going to be again focusing in on Galatians 3:10 and Romans 2-4. Are we cursed if we do, or are we cursed if we don't do? So that's the name of this live stream. Yeah, everybody's ate up with the Trinity in the chat. Anyways, all right, let's move on to a presentation. Again, I'm going to be reading. This is an exegetical commentary called Misunderstanding Galatians. And this is a a exegetical originalist commentary by a man named M. Cha. For the life of me, I can't recall his first name, but it starts with an M, and his last name is CHA. And so he's right within this vein of Paul within Judaism scholarship, along with people like Matthew Thiessen, Mark Nanos, Mark Kinzer, and a number of others that will be mentioned here. So he's sort of building on their work, taking it in some trajectories that maybe go beyond what they've written, and sort of doing some of his own work, which is always good. Here, the section that I'm going to be reading highlighted sections, just so we're not getting bogged down in the entirety of it. But again, the question that I'm going to be honing in on is chapter 3, leading up to, and he's already introduced the phrase ergon nomu back in chapter 2, verse 16. But we sort of, I wanted to hold us in here on Galatians 3, leading up to verses 10 through 12 is sort of the crux of the matter. And we're going to be looking at the dynamics, the inter-Jewish conflicts and dynamics that were happening in regards to what to do with Gentiles. And some of this scholarship will hone in on that. So this is his comments entering in on, sorry, there we go, on Galatians 3, verse 3. Are you so foolish? Having begun by the Spirit, are you now being perfected by the flesh? Did you suffer so many things in vain? If indeed it was in vain, so then does he who provides you with the Spirit and works miracles among you do it by works of law or by hearing with faith, or the obedience of hearing, or hearing with obedience? That's sort of, and again, you're going to hear me do this all the time, where you see the phrase works of the law. It's just ergon nomu. I'm just going to supply ergon nomu, just because I want to be faithful to what the text is saying. And I'm not the only one who does that. Even this scholar does it himself. He's just not as consistent with it as I am. So that's the point of that. Let's see. All right. So the contrast between, here's that phrase, ergon nomu, that's works of law, and pisteos Jesu Christu, that's the faith, literally the faithfulness of Jesus, the Messiah. In 2:16, and between ergon nomu and this phrase is akeos pisteos. That's the hearing of faith is where we get that, the Greek term that we get that from. So in 3:2, so there's a contrast between these phrases, is now presented in 3:3 as the contrast between spirit, pneumati, and flesh, sarxi. The connection Paul seems to be making is that the faithfulness of the Messiah, that's that pisteos Jesu Christu, in 2:16, the example of his heart obedience to the law of God is the hearing obedience of faithfulness. So again, the faithfulness exemplified through Messiah, that is the hearing of faithfulness that we're to walk in. That's what God accepts as truly righteous. This heart faithfulness to the law of God is what the Holy Spirit enables in his indwelling of believers. In sharp contrast, Paul uses works of law, ergon nomu, and flesh, sarxi, as synonymous terms. So works of law has to do with flesh. Flesh has to do with works of law. So whatever flesh is talking about, that's what works of law is talking about. So Paul uses those terms to describe the man-made stipulations of Pharisaic Judaism that failed to result in genuine righteousness. The phrase being perfected by the flesh, that's a sarxi epiteleothe, or ending with the flesh in 3 verse 3, probably refers to the official ritual of circumcision as a part of proselyte conversion under Pharisaic authority in Paul's time. I had to say that again. This phrase, this expression of being perfected by a flesh, it refers to the official ritual of circumcision as a part of this conversion process under Pharisaic authority to bring Gentiles into conversion. The apostle focuses on this antithesis between Pharisaic Judaism and the faithfulness of the Messiah throughout chapter 3, verses 1 through 18, and continues the spirit versus flesh motif. So while he's contrasting spirit and flesh, he's also contrasting the faithfulness of the Messiah with these regulations of Pharisaic Judaism. Ergo, flesh equals regulations of Pharisaic Judaism, and spirit equals the faithfulness of the Messiah. So I hope that's sort of making sense as we move forward. That's what I mean by letting Paul, what the commentator is doing is trying to allow Paul to make the connecting the terms that he makes himself so that he can define his own terms, as opposed to us trying to add definitions anachronistically into it. So although the specific reasons for the Galatians' suffering, in verse 4, are not explained, it is likely that they faced persecutions for their belief in the Messiah and identification with him. Thus, their suffering because of the Messiah would be in vain if they acknowledged the validity of Pharisaic authority. Now, what's not being stated here is he's already made comments on 2:16 through 2:21, where in 2:21 he makes the statement that if righteousness were through nomos, not ton nomo, not tu nomu, or like the law, but through law, again, works of law, then Christ has died for nothing. That's what he's bringing forth here. If you allow yourselves to go, Gentiles, if you allow yourself to go under this Pharisaic regulation and authority, you're no longer under Christ's authority and the righteousness that he revealed from heaven. And your suffering for the sake of Christ now means nothing, because now you're forsaking Christ to go under a different authority. And you're aligning yourself with an authority that interprets the law and has their own regulations differently. So, yeah, so that's, let's continue on. Might have to, how would I, wonder why I can't, no. That's something I'm going to have to figure out. Maybe if I, nope. There we go. Right. So continuing on, the comparative conjunction at the beginning of 3:6 associates Abraham's faithfulness. So now that we've established the connection between spirit and the faithfulness of Messiah, and between flesh and works of law, now we're going to talk about how Paul now connects the faithfulness of Abraham with the hearing of obedience of faithfulness. So that's what he does at the beginning of 3:6, is he makes that association at the end of Galatians 3:5. The Galatians' hearing of faith, through which they received the Holy Spirit, is likened to the faithfulness of Abraham in Genesis 15:6. Now, the patriarch Abraham is rightly esteemed as an exemplar of faithfulness in Jewish literature. Yet Paul tempers Jewish merit theology concerning the account of Abraham in Genesis 15:6. Now to the one who works. Now he's sort of making a comment or jumping to Romans 4:5 or Romans 4:4. Now to the one who works, his wage is not credited as favor, but as what is due. But to the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is credited as righteousness. That's Romans 4:4-5. At the same time, James in 2:23 cites Genesis 15:6 to prove that faith/faithfulness was working with Abraham's works, and as a result of the works, faithfulness was perfected. And a man is justified by works and not by faith, or faithfulness alone. Abraham's exemplary faithfulness and God's grace in justifying imperfect sinners are not mutually exclusive. So that's what the commenter, what he wants to, the point that he wants to make there. Oh, come on. Nope. What's going on here? I can't even see that. Let's go over here. Maybe that'll work. All right. So the nuance that seems to escape most commenters today, however, is that Paul's opponents in Galatians were likely citing Abraham in Genesis 17 to argue for the required rite of circumcision as a part of official proselyte conversion under Pharisaic authority. And I agree with him here. The reasoning of the agitators, the ones who wanted to quote unquote Judaize the Gentiles, was they're going back to a passage in Genesis 17 where not only are Abraham's physical descendants, primarily his physical descendants, are the ones who are to take on the mark of circumcision and that covenant, but also a slave or a servant who is bought from a foreigner. And incorporated into the household as a household member of Abraham, he too would be circumcised. And but who's the identity of this Gentile? Well, this Gentile is a slave, a servant, one who is bought. Maktah is the verb to buy with money. And that's pertinent here because Paul is actually making the argument that these people who want to Judaize the Gentiles by proselyte circumcision, they're wanting to actually make the Gentiles slaves. And that's pertinent because if you read on the end of chapter 3 into 4, particularly when he goes into his midrash on Sarah and Hagar, he's flipping the tables on these troublers. The troublers wanted to say that you won't become a son of Abraham unless you get circumcised. And Paul's flipping the tables like, actually, no, you're turning the Gentiles into slaves, and you yourselves are slaves. You're actually not sons because you're not trusting in the faithfulness of Messiah. You're inventing a righteousness of your own. So I really hope that that's clicking with people. The context of Galatians will really start to come together for you if this is like new information to you. This isn't new information for scholarship. We understand that the phrase works of law has a Hebraic or a Hebrew counterpart in the Dead Sea Scrolls in a collection of documents that have been that include the phrase Miksat Mahaseh HaTorah, which loosely translates to some works of law. And we'll get into that. The commentary here will touch on this because we have in those documents, we have both the phrase works of law and it shall be reckoned to you as righteousness. Those are two phrases that figures prominently in Paul's discourse. And there's a reason for that. It's because he's coming up against people who are creating their own community rules and their own standard of righteousness and calling it, this is how, if you do these things, it shall be reckoned as righteousness. But those things are not the law of Moses. And that's the whole crux of Paul's polemics against works of law. They fall short of the righteousness that is revealed from heaven. And it's just as Jesus said, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, because many times they invented their own traditions and they set aside the law of Moses and therefore fall short of the righteousness that God desires. If we're to enter the kingdom, our righteousness needs to match Yeshua's righteousness, not dip to the level of Pharisees who did their works in order to receive praise from men, but not from God. So, man, I mean, I could go on and on and on in regards to that because this is Jesus is dealing with the same thing Paul is dealing with. And many of you would probably agree, but I'm flipping that thing on its head because modern scholarship is really flipping those traditional readings on their head. Yeah, uh, Rick, you have a fine way of setting aside the commandments of Yahweh uh, and observe the traditions of men. Yep, that's from uh, Matthew 15, Mark 7, um, quoting Isaiah. You honor me with your lips, or your hearts are far from me, teaching as precepts or teaching as doctrine, like as actual teaching, or as teaching as law, the regulations of men. So yeah, huge point there. That's all over the place in Jesus's discourse. But again, not once do you see Jesus saying, "You Pharisees, you're trying to do the law too much. You need to stop doing that to try to earn your righteousness and your salvation." No, that never happens. In fact, what the Pharisees are doing are putting impossible burdens on people and not even using a finger to lift the burden to help them. But these are man-made yokes, not not the not truly being yoked to God. All right, so before I get lost into the weed, um, yeah. So let's see. As Dunn explains, this is James Dunn. He's one of these proponents of this new perspective on Paul. As one who had himself abandoned idols at the call of God, Abraham was remembered as, in effect, the first proselyte and type of true conversion. In places like Philo, Josephus, and Antiquities. Abraham, therefore, was the classic test case for what acceptance by God involved. In other words, Paul's opponents were using Abraham to mandate their sectarian traditions, while the gospel was clarifying the true nature of the patriarch's right standing before God. Paul's problem was not with the biblical command of circumcision recorded in Genesis 17, but with the forced requirement for new Gentile believers to undergo proselyte conversion under Pharisaic authority to be considered in right standing before God. And I have to make this point. I make it 1,000 times until it starts to sink in. Uh, the circumcision that was being practiced upon Gentiles by these Pharisaic authorities was not the circumcision commanded for the physical descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in Genesis 17. They went to that passage to justify their regulation, but it was a false interpretation. They were misusing the commandment of God to establish their own standard, and thus mistreat the Gentiles, which is one thing that actually calls down a curse upon you, according to Deuteronomy 26. That's one of the curses. If you mistreat a Gentile, one of the nations, and this would be considered of that. Thus, why Paul is saying that those who are of works of law, this regulation, are under a curse, because while they're practicing this high and lofty idea of theirs that this will make us righteous, they are falling short of God's commandments and actually not doing God's commandments, which is something he says, and he requires of us to do, to walk before him, to walk humbly, to fear him and obey his commandments. But these people were not doing that. They were doing something completely different. Um, so let's skip down. Where's the next? Okay, maybe start here. Man, I need a mouse or something. This trackpad is not working for me. There we go. So therefore, Paul's argument in Galatians 3:6 is to contrast Abraham's like hearing, obedience, of faithfulness, as described in Genesis 15:6, with sectarian works of law and Pharisaic oral traditions that his opponents claimed Abraham adhered to. Paul focused on Abraham in this section because religious Jews of this time portrayed Abraham as a keeper of Jewish, he's going to go on to say Jewish oral law. Um, Thus, Paul's concern in this section and throughout the epistle is with the man-made religious stipulations, not the actual Old Testament commandments of God. When the apostle contrasts ergon nomu with the hearing of faith, sometimes I'm just not going to pronounce the Greek, but this is the phrase, the hearing of faithfulness. In Galatians 3:2 and 5, he is emphasizing the difference between sectarian rules of Jewish oral law and the simple hearing obedience of faithfulness exemplified by Abraham. For Paul, there is no conflict between the hearing of faithfulness in Galatians 3:2 and 5 and the biblical law of God. So let's make that clear. The hearing of faithfulness is actually in relationship. It's not opposed to the law of Moses. They're meant to walk hand in hand. And that's his point. Some commentators may argue that Paul's citation of Genesis 15:6 and Galatians 3:6 proves that the hearing of faith in Galatians 3:2 refers solely to the Galatians hearing of the gospel message in faith. But Max Rogland, however, has contended that the wekatal form of emunah, that's the verb where it says Abraham believed, trusted, faithed, in Genesis 15:6 expresses repeated activity, an imperfective situation. So what he's talking about is it's almost acting like a participle verb. So it would be more accurately translated as "and he kept believing" rather than "and he believed" like once at one moment in time and then God justified him. But no, the wechatal form of imana is expressing an imperfect, pardon me, way, imperfect action. So it's something that's in the present, continuing into the present and ongoing. So that's like the participle type verb. Now let's move on down. Now we're getting to verse 7 of Galatians 3. Therefore, be sure that it is those who are of faith who are sons of Abraham. It is easy to misinterpret this verse without carefully considering the flow of Paul's preceding argument. The apostle continues to focus on the rhetorical antithesis between Pharisaic Judaism and the faithfulness taught and lived out by the Messiah. God establishes the Abrahamic covenant between himself and Abraham's descendants. Since covenant membership and blessing were limited to Abraham's descendants, the debate Paul addresses in Galatians 3:7 is how to acquire status as a descendant of Abraham. For Paul's opponents, the means of covenant inclusion were physical lineage, birth, or if you weren't a physical lineage, you had to be a proselyte and go through that conversion process. For Paul, however, the only requirement to become an offspring of Abraham was to possess Abraham-like faithfulness to God, as expressed in obedience, the hearing of faithfulness. As Dunn observes, Abraham was naturally regarded as the father of the Jewish people, naturally, the founder of the Jewish race. Israel naturally thought of itself as the seed of Abraham and counted descent from him a matter of pride. So you see that in places like there are 3 Maccabees, some of the intertestamental period. Keener notes that Jewish people regularly spoke of our father Abraham and themselves as his children. Consequently, Paul's opponents likely argued that in order for new Gentile believers to experience the full blessings of God, they needed to be attached to Abraham and his descendants. But I'm just noticing in the chat here, his beard is coming back quickly. I agree. Not sure how long he's had it, but he had it when I first started following. It's been so long since I've been shaven. I don't know. Anyways, yeah. So I'm quickly trying to get as much of my beard back as I can. Many of you have seen me in the past, knew that I had quite a long beard, but I had to change jobs and change my face, so to speak. So Um, um, so consequently, Paul's opponents likely argued that in order for new Gentile believers to experience the full blessings of God, they needed to be attached to Abraham and his descendants through circumcision. Moreover, in order to be considered righteous like Abraham, a true son of Abraham must obey the oral law. Now, again, from this vantage point, these people have this weird interpretation that Abraham was just like them, that he was fully obedient to this oral law. They are retrojecting and in a sort of retrograde way their own regulations back into the time of Abraham, and then using Abraham as the litmus test. Um, if he did it, then you also Gentiles need to do it this way. It's very anachronistic, and it's the source of Paul's opposition to this regulation. It is actually not in accord with the law of Moses or the covenant with Abraham. It's a distortion. So thus, according to Paul's opponents, true Abraham-like righteousness was tied to the requirements of Pharisaic Judaism. You notice the circular reasoning there? I hope that sort of connects with you as we're going through this. So in response, Paul argues in Galatians 3:7, be sure that it is those who are of faithfulness who are sons of Abraham, not who are of oral law or of works of law. No, works of law is not of faithfulness, but rather the hearing, obeying is of faithfulness. Those are who are the sons of Abraham. The true sons of Abraham, both Jew and Gentile, are those who exhibit Abraham's hearing, obedience of faithfulness. The same heart loyalty manifested in the faithfulness of the Messiah. Rather than the religious system of Pharisaic Judaism, it is the heart faithfulness modeled by the Messiah and Abraham that God acknowledges as righteous. So I just want to make a brief point here. I promise that I'm not going to be too much longer with this. We're going to talk about the 4Q MMMT documents here shortly, but I just want to say that knowing if this is the stance that I'm taking, what am I saying in terms of what's the application for us today? Well, the point that I'm trying to say is that the context Paul is speaking into is one of people coming in of their own authority, and they've created a standard of righteousness that they've invented, and they say that this is the way to be a son of Abraham. You must come under our authority, listen to us and our regulations, and take an oath and do these things, get circumcised according to our regulations, and then you'll be a true son. Yeah, you believe in Jesus, you follow the Messiah and stuff like that, and you're doing you're doing the law of Moses, but you're not interpreting it correctly. You're still slaves. So we're going to help you become sons and do it our way. That's a man-made tradition. That's works of law. That's what Paul calls works of law. So if we extrapolate that out and make application today, think of any system or whether written or unwritten, explicit or inferred standard of action or behavior that a group sets up as the standard. That's what they identify themselves by as truly righteous people. And then they foist that system onto others and say, you must do it this way if you're going to be a part of our community. Never mind the fact that those things aren't explicitly in the law of Moses, but it's our interpretation. So trust me, bro. Is sort of how that is. The very idea of salvation being this idea of, well, you say the prayer and you accept Jesus in your heart, and then he saves you, and then your soul immediately is perfect and righteous before God, and it doesn't matter what, even though you're stuck in sin in the flesh, it doesn't really matter, because the true you, the real you, is up in heaven with God, and you're perfect in his eyes. That's a work of law. That's a man-made tradition. That sets up a standard of righteousness that man invented, by which you then set aside the actual commands of God, and you can set aside scruples of being patient, long-suffering, full of peace, joy, loving kindness, the fruits of the Spirit. You don't really have to do that. You don't have to manifest those things because your soul is perfect. According to the standard that the doctrine that we believe. I mean, that's works of law, folks. That's what works of law is in our context. It's the same thing. Yeah. So let's see. Let's scroll down. Yeah. Okay. So Tim Hegg, in his commentary, explains the need for precision when interpreting works of law in Galatians 3:10. It is clear that in the first century, the oral Torah, the rulings of the sages that had taken on halakhic authority, had found its place alongside of the written Torah. In some cases, it was viewed as secondary to the written Torah, but in practical measures, it was received as equal or even superior. The prevailing view was that the oral Torah gave the proper manner in which the written Torah was to be obeyed. We must remember then that when we encounter the word nomos, law, in apostolic scriptures, we cannot simply presume that the books of Moses are its referent. Such a monolithic approach to the word ignores the historical setting. We must, in every case, at least give way to the possibility that the written and oral Torah are viewed as a unified whole to one degree or another in the use of the word law or nomos. James Dunn continues, with Dunn, Hegg emphasizes the importance of the Dead Sea Scroll document 4Q in understanding Paul's use of the terms law and righteousness in Galatians. The fact that both the phrases works of the Torah, or that phrase miksah ma'aseh haTorah, and counted as righteousness are found in this document is incredibly important for understanding the same phrases in Paul. What we now see is that the phrase works of law or /Torah was used in Paul's day to refer to specific sets of rules or halakha, which a given group required in terms of its self-definitions. Simply put, such a list of works of law constituted the entrance requirements into the group. I'm going to switch here again. Since the group would no doubt consider its own interpretations of the written Torah to be the correct interpretation, they would also have held that only those who adhere to their halakha would actually be obeying the Torah and living righteously. Works of the Torah then refers to the halakha required for entrance into the covenant community, as envisioned by each sect, not personal obedience to God's word. And since covenant membership was considered one and the same with the status of righteous, it is not difficult to understand how adhering to the given set of halachot to gain membership in the community was one and the same to being reckoned as righteous. I think just one more quick section, folks. I might skip a little bit of this, but I want to get down to here in this section here. Come on, there. So here we go. Paul is not addressing, so we're getting into verse 10 here. Those who are works of law are under a curse. So Paul is not addressing obedience to the biblical commandments of God in Galatians 3:10, nor requiring flawless obedience to the law of God. In the larger context of Galatians 3, the apostle is contrasting two different systems of law, one that is man-made, based on works of law, Pharisaic halakha, and falls under the covenant curses because of its inadequacy, and one that is based on hard obedience to the biblical commandments of God recorded in Scripture. In contrast to traditional Christian interpretations, David Stern rightly challenges the flawless compliance reading of Galatians 3:10. Despite the contrary opinions of many Christian interpreters, His point is not the imperfect human nature is incapable of keeping all the commandments of the Torah, for he neither says this nor proves it. On the contrary, the Torah itself, anticipating, here we go, switch again, that people will fall short of complete obedience and thereby go out of the fellowship with God, states what those who disobey Torah commands must do in order to restore such fellowship. They must repent. Sometimes they must bring a prescribed sacrifice. Not only does the Torah expect disobedience, but it makes explicit provision for it, mentioning sin offerings in 20 chapters of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and some 120 times in the Tanakh. Thus, according to Stern, the apostle's point in Galatians 3:10 is not that people are unable to obey the law of God perfectly, but that legalists, in particular, merely by being legalists, violate at least one of the Torah's commands. What he's saying there is that to fixate on certain regulations and things that you've invented and elevate those to the status of what makes you righteous is a legalistic move. And by doing so, the very nature of that act is a violation of the law, because you're setting aside the law by doing that. So it's fundamentally a violation. And that's why Paul says what he says in verse 10. So merely by being legalists violate at least one of the Torah's commands, and therefore, on the basis of Deuteronomy 27:26 and the other verses cited, they, 1, do not attain life, and 2, are not righteous, and 3, come under a curse. This curse is comprised of the covenant curses recorded in Deuteronomy 28:15-68. So last point here. Moreover, Deuteronomy is written with the perspective that God intends Israel to obey his laws and that she is able to do so. Paul even quotes Deuteronomy 30:12 and 14 in Romans 10:6 and 8. Hegg asserts, no one in Paul's day believed that anyone could live out Torah perfectly, and no teacher would have required such a thing. To abide in the things of the Torah meant living within the provisions of the Torah, including its provisions for what a person was to do when he or she sinned. Paul's modifications of Deuteronomy 27:26 and Galatians 3:10 to include the phrase things written in the book of the law is significant. If ergon nomu in Galatians 3:10 refers to the halakhic observance of a particular Jewish sect, then Paul is clearly not opposing obedience to the biblical laws of God. In other words, to be of the works of law is not equivalent to faithful heart obedience to God's laws. It is apparently less than what the law of God requires. This is made clear later in Galatians 6:13, where he says, those who desire you to be circumcised or who are of works of law don't themselves keep the law. That's the point, because works of law is something that when you rely on it, you actually fall short of the law of God, because you're doing something different. So, with that being said, yeah, I think I'll stop there with that. Let's see. Yeah, and I'm going to go ahead and pin the link to join in the chat. Let's see. All right, there it is. Let's see. Then I'm gonna. Yep, I can't pin it there. So what I'll do is maybe I'll do this. Computer's a little slow here. All right, and and teach Yahweh, Kanisha, if you're listening in, and I see you there in the chat, are you able to see the StreamYard link in your stream? Let me know in the chat there, just so I know that you have it, so people on your stream can see it as well. Oh, no, that's not the one I wanted. Rivers says in Galatians 3:10, the term works of law is equivalent to all that is written in the book of the law. Thus, Paul is not making a distinction. He's using works of law for the Pentateuch. Again, that's just false. I mean, I don't know if you've been paying attention at all to what I've read, Rivers. Um, the internal logic of his argument is that those who are of works of law are not doing the law, and therefore they're doing something else. Therefore, they're setting aside the book of the law and not doing the things required in it. They're doing their own requirements. Thus, they're putting themselves under a curse. I hope that should be obvious by now. I've provided overwhelming evidence that Paul actually dichotomizes between works of law and the things written in the Pentateuch. So, yeah. All right. So, again, the link to join is in the chat. So feel free to come up and join. Oopsie. Need to figure out what's going on with my. All right, looks like we've got the sect, the way here. Let me go ahead and bring you on.
Shalom, shalom.
Hello. So, what's your position on the question of what Paul means in Galatians 3:10 with works of law and being under a curse? Or do you have some other thoughts you want?
Actually, I do have some, but I don't have my paper right here. But I was curious, or I agree with everything you've said so far. So didn't really have any questions on that. But yeah, the works of the law. Like you said, there was the washing of hands traditions, the eating with Peter getting called out for eating with the Gentiles. That's what they were referring to as the laws that separate you, because there were the man traditions. That was what the Pharisees were pushing. That was not God's way.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, if you don't mind, I'll take a minute here. I had something I wanted to ask you.
Sure.
And I wanted to take some notes. So let me grab some paperwork.
Let me pull this. So, and while you're doing that, I'm going to just make some comments here on verses 10 through 12. Sort of working off of that, the way this the logic of his argument that I'm finding how it works is moving from the fact that works of law is something that when you rely upon it, you actually set aside and don't continue in the things written in the book of the law, and you actually transgress by doing works of law. Because of that, or now, it is evident in light of that no one is justified before God in law. And again, many English translations like to supply the definite article there before law, but it's not there in the Greek. You can look at that for yourself. And Paul is really consistent with this grammatical distinction, and the reason being because, again, how is Paul going to be in his right mind, or how is he not going to be out of his mind to say something like, it is evident that no one is justified before God by doing the law? That's how some translations even put this, or by doing the commandments of the law, when he flips right around in Romans 2:13 and says, it is the doers of the law who will be declared righteous. Not a righteous before men, or righteous like doing good things. No, righteous before God. And he's in the context he's talking about at the judgment day, based on doing the law. So you can't square that circle unless you recognize that no one is justified before God in law is something different and opposed to the obedience of faithfulness, opposed to the hearing of faith, opposed to doing the commandments. And they're actually not the same thing. And we know it's evident that no one is justified before God in law because, quoting Habakkuk 2:4 or 2:14, the righteous will live out of faithfulness. Or in the Masoretic text literally has will live by his faithfulness. Speaking of the man will live by his faithfulness. And furthermore, that law, the law that he's talking about, is not out of faithfulness. Rather, or on the contrary, quoting Leviticus 18:5, the one having done these things will live in them. So that's the clincher. Paul is equating living by faith with doing the commandments and living. He brings Habakkuk 2:14 and Leviticus 18:5 together beautifully through the shared verb will live. It's the one who is of faith who will live, and it's the one who does the commandments who will live. Ergo, faithfulness means doing the commandments. It's basic math. It's basic logic there. You put two and two together. And that's his. So sorry, didn't mean to go long-winded there. I didn't want to keep you from commenting.
Well, actually, what was you in the Greek? What were you using for faithfulness? The word.
So the Greek verb is pisteo, which is fidelity, faithfulness, trust. It answers to the Hebrew emunah, which is faithfulness, trust.
Yeah, because like I said, I think I mentioned last week, it just seems like it's a simple word problem for people throwing out words and everything, but there is a meanings to those words. Everybody has a faith, but it's the faith of the Messiah is what you want. You don't, know. So
yeah, when you think about yoking yourself to the faith of Messiah, well, obviously Messiah did more than just believe some stuff. Like he did things. He manifested obedience, and it's actually links that to God actually revealing his righteousness from heaven through the obedience of Jesus. And when you think about yoking yourself to that and trusting in that, when you correlate that to yourself, if faith for Yeshua was actually doing, being obedient, then faith for us likewise means that we're to walk in his footsteps, as Peter says.
Yeah, I like you. A lot of people say this yoke is a yoke of burden to the law, but the Bible tells us in Deuteronomy 30:11, and it's God Himself speaking. What I give to you is not difficult. It's not far off. It's not over the sea. It's not up in heaven. So when they're talking that burden of the law, He's referring to man's add-ons, the ones that Messiah was calling out.
Yeah, I want to highlight this comment here. It's very interesting. I kind of like where this guy where your head is. I don't know where your name is, Western Arctic Alaska. But he says the logic of Takanot and Gezerot sits underneath Galatians 3:19 in the same way it sits underneath Acts 10, but the target is different. In Acts 10, Peter confronts purity fences that excluded Gentiles. In Galatians 3:19, Paul confronts covenant fences that tried to add requirements to Gentile conclusion. So why then the law? Is verse 19 here. It was added on account of transgressions. Or some might say, some translations might say for transgressions or concerning transgressions, until the seed to whom promise had been made shall have come. Now, this until this, I think it's an adverb. I want to say it's an adverb here. Let me pull this up real quick. Oh, I'm sorry. It's a preposition, acris. Let's go back here. It's some people read that as like something happening until and then it stops. But no, something can happen until something and then continue after that. This isn't communicating a strict termination point at the until. I would say, yeah, I'm maybe you can help me out in the comments, or maybe you are commenting, Arctic. So I'd like to see maybe a little bit more. I don't know if you're able to even come up on the panel and maybe explain a little bit more. I'd like to see, in your own words, sort of how you're making that connection, because I think I get where you're getting at, but I need a little bit more clarity from you. So you said he is not saying Torah was added because Israel sinned. I agree with that, by the way. Torah existed long before Sinai. He is saying the Sinai covenantal legislation was added to contain, define, and expose transgression until the seed came. Right. And I don't believe that at that point then the covenant ends or terminates. Essentially what you have is the law that, as I agree with you, already existed, is brought in. We who have died to that law that was at work in our own members so that we could be free to live to righteousness. Now we have a different relationship with the law. It's in our heart. It's intended to be in our hearts. And when we walk in step with the Spirit, we're no longer warring against the law that was there to constrain, so to speak. So that's kind of in my own words. I'm sort of teasing out sort of what I think where you're getting at. DB, I see you in the backstage there. Let me bring you up too.
Thank you.
Hi, shalom.
Hey there. Yeah, it's interesting. So you're arguing that, if I'm following correctly, that what Paul was protesting about in Galatians is not so much the written law or the Mosaic law, is that the man-made aspect, or if you want to call it the oral law to some degree, just the traditions of the Pharisees and whomever. And this is what you're saying, that what Paul was protesting about.
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay, thank you. I'm going to sit back for a bit, let somebody else comment. Just let me look into it. Thank you.
Hmm? Let me-
Sorry, since nobody's up at the moment. Jared, do you feel that are we obligated to obey the law unto salvation?
It's an interesting question. I, for the purposes of the discussion, I, I kind of, I sort of leave questions like that for people to sort of contemplate and maybe make application on their own. On their own, I, I mean, I can offer at least some things from my perspective on that. But for the purposes of what we're doing here, I'd like to. I try to confine, in other words, the discussion to understanding what Paul was saying in this context and what he was meaning, and then if we kind of get that solidified and have an understanding of that, then we're able to like make right application for us today. Pardon me for 1 second. Let me.
So
Understood.
in short, did you just ask if the law was part of salvation or for salvation? Is that what you asked?
That's what I asked. If it was
Yeah.
requisite for salvation.
Well, I can speak for myself because I am saved or trying to be saved. That's why I do it. It's the opposite. I don't do it for salvation. I do it because I think I am saved.
God, I think I understand what you're saying. Right. We behave righteously in respect to Jesus and the Father and so forth, because that's what pleases them. But it's not. I wouldn't lose my salvation over breaking the Sabbath, over not eating kosher, and so forth. I believe that's what you're saying.
Well, yeah, it's a heart matter to me. So I'm not going to break the Sabbath or anything. So, but it's like I said, I'm not doing this for salvation. I'm accepting salvation, and this is a part of what it has led me to.
Understood. Thank you.
Yeah. And DB, to go a little bit further from my part in answering a question. Coming from the vantage point that from the picture that I have from my own studies is that Paul definitely and the other apostles definitely did create communities of Jewish and Gentile believers living in community together, where Gentile believers coming out of their pagan traditions and coming into the knowledge of the Holy One of Israel, and his statutes, his ordinances, his covenants and promises, no longer strangers to those, but being fellow citizens of the Commonwealth of Israel. There was no longer a dividing wall that kept them at arm's length away from God's commandments as Gentiles, but brought them near. That's Paul's language. And so there was the expectation, I mean, just practically speaking, in the first century context, you would not have Gentiles and Jews fellowshipping together, the primary expression of which would be table fellowship. You would not have that in any practical way of moving forward if Gentiles were not abstaining from unclean things according to Leviticus 11 and Deuteronomy 14. It would not happen in any practical way. You could not have table fellowship if they were just free to do that. If Jews were doing their thing and then Gentile believers were coming in with their ham sandwiches and sitting next to you, that is not a realistic picture. It's sort of nonsensical when you think about it. So from that vantage point, that's the picture that I have. But I also understand, I mean, I'm just speaking real. The idea of today Jews and Gentiles being in the type of fellowship that they would have been experiencing under apostolic tradition, that ship has sailed. Maybe God some way somehow will bring that about again, but it's the parting of ways is so far gone that there's the dividing wall of hostility has been put back up and buttressed even more with tradition, with polemics, with hatred, and on both sides. And so I'm just being real. Like, I don't. How do I even address that? How do I even talk about that? How do
Is
I come up
that
with
is
any?
that does that dissension exist within Messianic Jews, like Christian Jews, or do you mean Jews that obey Judaism and Christians, or do you mean within the church, the Jews are still in faction against the Gentiles? Is that what you mean?
Well, what I mean is there's the dynamic that exists even within a bunch of what can be called Messianic Jewish circles. There's still divide on. Um, there's still a strong impetus for Messianic Jews to keep Gentiles away from even trying to observe the commandments, because there's this strong dividing wall of saying, no, that's not for you. It's only for us. If you try to do it, you're just trying to be Jews like us. And unfortunately, that's I'm not saying that that's not without cause. I mean, they have reasons for that, because all manner of Gentiles come up and they do their own things and they think that they're observing the commandments. And so it's like we both parties need to shape up and get in step with the Spirit, and maybe recover a bit of the Apostle Paul's passion for bringing these things together. It's been lost in most respects. So Gentiles are taking upon themselves to do their own things in pride and arrogance in many ways. Sincerely, sure. That's there too, that there's sincerity. But then there's Jewish believers who are holding on to the notion that there's a very strong and firm distinction theology between Jews and Gentiles, when Paul actually meant to break down the dividing wall. Yes, Gentiles remain Gentiles, but they're in covenant with God, just like they've always been welcomed into covenant with God. But they're not meant to be kept at arm's length and treated as second-class citizens within the Commonwealth.
Right. Gotcha. Thank you. Yeah.
I do want to. I've had this comment up here from Del Rey for a little bit, because I find it a really fascinating question. What would you say to those who say the law pertaining to sacrifices that was added because of transgression? So he's again referring to verse 19 there. Why then the law? It was added. There are groups of people within maybe the wider Torah observant movement who, I think it's reactionary. I think it's a reactionary impetus to try to salvage in their theology obedience to the law of Moses, in light of a verse like verse 19 that says, why then the law? It was added on account of transgressions, until the seed to whom promise has been made shall have come. Now, what these people in their reactionary approach, in other words, I'm drawing attention to people who are maybe they call themselves Nazarenes. They're of this opinion that the law that was added was not the law of Moses. It's in reference.
Did you lose your voice? I can't hear you.
You can't hear me? Hello?
Now I can. Now I can.
Oh. There's groups of people like Nazarenes who are of the opinion that the law that was added on account of transgressions is the sacrificial system. The laws pertaining to the sacrifices in the Levitical priesthood, those things were added, and then when the seed came, it's those things that stopped being relevant. But the wider law of Moses, that still continues. So it's sort of a reactionary or apologetic means of trying to salvage the law of Moses from this verse. The issue with if I'm to provide an answer of what I think, Del Rey, about this idea, this teaching. I don't agree with it at all, because there's nothing about sacrifices at all in chapter 3. I mean, it doesn't mention, not even a hint of sacrifices, Levitical priesthood, or anything like that. So I just, that's a no-go for me from that vantage point. But secondly, there is no reason to accept the premise and just take it as a given that this is referring to whatever law this is. It ended when the seed came. That's not what this verse is communicating. In fact, he says, is the law, in verse 21, is the law therefore contrary to the promises of God? Never may it be. So he's already heading that idea off at the pass. Some people might get the idea that he's saying that the law ended. It's like, no. The law is not contrary to the promises. So if the promise comes, the promise doesn't replace the law, because they're not in opposition to each other. So we don't need to accept that premise as exegetes. That's a very popular premise. That's a very popular, potent way of reading verse 19, especially among those who want to do away with the law. But that's not what's going on in verse 19 at all, because he already heads that off at the pass. He doesn't let that premise fly very long before shooting it down.
Well, it's an interesting, the next verse, is the law therefore contrary to the promises of God? Never may it be. For if the law were given being able to make alive, then righteousness indeed would have been from out of the law. So that next statement seems to invalidate the efficacy of the law to make one righteous and so forth. So you're right. I've always been confused by verse 21, the first part. First part.
Yeah, so this is interesting. I get what you're saying there, DB. Verse 21, the next part of that, where it goes on to say, may it never be, for if a law were given being able to make alive or give life or impart life, as some translations put it, then righteousness indeed would have been through law. And again, it's not out of the law, it's out of law. Now, this is a premise that I don't think we need to, as exegetes, to grant, because again, it would be creating a contradiction both in Paul and in the law of Moses itself. Deuteronomy, the foundation, the document that we should start with as our foundation, itself declares that if you are careful to do all these things, it will be life for you. You will live long in the land which I will give you.
For sure. And it was their righteousness.
It states that it, like, as bookends. It states it both at the beginning of Deuteronomy and in chapter 30 at the end. This will be life for you. So, and then Paul himself says in Romans 7 that the commandment, which was intended to give life, did that produce, or was that sin, or did that produce death? No, the thing that brings life did not produce death. It was another law Paul speaks about that was at work in his members, that rose up to taking opportunity through the commandment, which brings life, to produce death in him. So Paul himself affirms the God's statements in Deuteronomy that the law brings life. So when he says in 21, for if a law were given being able to make alive, then righteousness indeed would have been through law. What's he saying? What he's saying here is that the law of Moses is not contrary to the promise, but there is a law that is contrary to it. And it's this law that if it could bring life, then righteousness would have been through law. Paul again is saying, he's going right back to the statement of the conclusion of verse 11. It is evident that no one is justified or righteousness comes in law. The promise and the law are not contrary to one another. Therefore, and since the law is intended to bring life, and in fact it is able to bring life if you walk according to the Spirit, then in other words, if there's this law and it was able to bring life, then righteousness would have come through law. But it's already evident that righteousness doesn't come through law, man-made regulations. Ergo, that law does not bring life. It does not impart life. It does not negate the fact that the law of Moses is intended to bring life, and it can, if you walk according to the footsteps of Messiah. So, do you have any contentions on that, or?
Well, it's like Jared. It's like you're. Bear with me here. You could be valid. You could be correct. But I just want to make this clear. I want to so I understand correctly. You are introducing what I believe to be a sort of another element here. So what we have in juxtaposition is the law versus the faith of Christ. And I think that is clear that at least for sure the Levitical law is in focus when he talks about Abraham, what was instituted 430 years later. I think unmistakably that would be the Levitical law. That's the time of Moses and so forth. But you were saying so. So we have Paul now bringing up one sort of institution, talking about the new the new one, if you will, faith in Christ. But you're saying also he's also making reference to another law. And that's your premise, correct? So we have to be careful when we read law, which law that he's referring to, without the definition being there, or the clause clarifying that.
Mhm. And I would just contend that even when not so many words are being stated, the fact of the matter is there is an entire inter-Jewish debate that has been going on since and before the time of Jesus when he was ministering in the flesh, and Jesus himself came up upon this law, which is typified in man-made regulations. When he, let's see, let me gather my thoughts here. I was going somewhere in my head, but then I somewhat lost track of my train of thought there. Yeah, so there's a, for instance, the law of Moses regulates certain things in regards to ritual purity to keep yourself from being defiled. That's a real thing. There are things that can defile you because they're contaminated, not necessarily because they're inherently unclean. And that's sort of where the defilement language comes in distinction to clean and unclean. Defilement is a different term together, and that puts you into the jurisdiction of things like ritual purity, where you might have something like a piece of food that is in the clean category and therefore is defined as food for you. It can enter into your mouth, in other words, and yet it comes into contact or is suspected of coming into contact with something that is unclean. And then that defiles that thing. It becomes ritually impure, and you have to either wash it or dispose of it. You wouldn't be able to put it in your mouth, not because it would cause you to sin, but because it would make you defiled and impure, so that you couldn't go into the presence of God. That's a big deal. You'd have to go through a series of washings and be unclean till evening, and such and things like that. So you have this category of ritual impurity, and you're trying to avoid that in a practical way. Now, the Pharisees went beyond what the law of Moses prescribed and indicated would make you impure, and they created fence instructions to where that are even stricter to where you wouldn't even get the intent is like you wouldn't even get in close to being in that category of impure. So they would wash cups and things, and they would wash their hands a certain way. It's not just going to a faucet and washing your hands. They actually had a specific container that was constructed a certain way, and you had to wash your hands this way. And the disciples in Mark 7 weren't doing that. And all the while, what Jesus rebukes them for is the crux of the matter. They had fixated on these extra regulations, these fences. That's why I brought up this comment. Western Arctic Rivers disagrees wholeheartedly with this, but there's no debating this. Paul uses law to refer to Torah, but works of law refers to halakhic identity fences, not the Pentateuch. And the Galatian controversy is not about Moses, it is about human expansions of Moses. That's correct, because when the Pharisees, when they exalted themselves and their standard of washing themselves, they fixated that on so much that what does Jesus go on to say? What actually is it that defiles you? It's not eating food without unwashed hands, because that doesn't make you impure, because the food enters your mouth and then into your stomach and then is expelled through the digestive system and is purged from you. It doesn't go into your heart. But what comes out of their hearts when you're fixated on works of law is anger, hatred, murder, things that actually do defile you from the inside out. And those things are directly violations of the commandments. And the Pharisees were okay with doing that. They were okay with dishonoring their father and mother by doing the korban thing, whatever service I may have rendered to you, mother, father, I've given it to God. It's therefore korban. It's to the Lord now. Therefore, by your tradition, you dishonor your father and mother, which is a transgression of a weighty matter of the commandments. And so that's a practical example. And those who aren't getting on board with this works of law being halakhic identity fences, you just need to read the Gospels again with this in mind. I mean, Arctic Alaska is right on here. Yeah, I yield on that. Any comments? I'm sorry, I'm being long-winded. I'm babbling.
No, that's fine. Thank you. You were quite exhaustive with that. You're proving it, and you're right. And I agree with you. With all the points you made are totally valid. I think they were contextual. I think they were sort of reserved, if you will, or confined to just the context that Jesus was using them. Only because I would find Galatians, I'd be very somewhat cryptic. I wouldn't know where to make the demarcation point necessarily, unless my presupposition would say, well, he must be talking about the oral law here, or the fence law in this particular case, because it contravenes what I believe to be about the Mosaic law. And I'm not trying to say that you're doing that, Jared, but if I was left with that principle, that hermeneutic to interpret this with, it would be very subjective now, because I don't find any sort of disclaimers there with Paul stating I'm not referring to the Levitical law anymore. I am now referring to the man-made laws and so forth. I would find that be sort of an exegetical nightmare a bit if I retained that principle.
Kind of is, because that's why Second Peter gives a specific warning about it.
Mm-hmm. Right, and let me bring something. Maybe I've touched on it. I don't know if I've made it clear enough, DB. This issue, the central issue that's being addressed here, is proselyte circumcision. You would agree with that, correct?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think no. Sorry, I need to be careful about that. It precipitated the discussion. Thank you. I precipitated the discussion. I think Paul is taking it to a broader sense. That's my understanding.
Okay, yeah, I understand. So let me maybe repeat your position back to you so I understand it correctly. Your position is that yes, Paul addresses circumcision, but your position is that he's expanding it beyond circumcision to a wider principle concerning the entirety of the law of Moses. Is that correct?
Exactly.
Can you identify in the passage where you believe Paul is making that expansion from circumcision?
Yeah, well,
so you can help me understand where you're going with that.
Right, because of the amount of references to the law that he's keeping it at that level. He's not talking about circumcision and then gives you a comprehensive argumentation why circumcision is wrong, because it's superficial. You cut off the foreskin, it doesn't do much. He doesn't elaborate from that standpoint. Circumcision is just something that was instituted way back in Abraham times, and it doesn't Like he doesn't he argues from the law. How did you receive the Spirit? Was it by your works? And he keeps it at that level, works. He doesn't repeat circumcision. That's the core of his argument. It's sort of, he always refers to the law as the law, not just the law of circumcision, or the Abrahamic covenant, however you want to put it. He doesn't make that terminology. He keeps it as the law and as works. And how did you come to Christ, to believe in Christ? It was through your faith. You were instilled with the Holy Spirit, not because you did something this way or that way. He doesn't say. He does at one point say because you were. Was it because you were circumcised? But he elaborates. Was it anything that you did? And I think that's for just those reasons, just the terminology that he uses, the examples that he gives, and he doesn't really focus on the inferiority of circumcision or the inefficacy of it. Like, where he logistically lays it down. You cut off the foreskin, what does that do for you? It's superficial, it gets dirty, whatever. He doesn't argue from that standpoint. That would be my position. That's the reason.
Okay. I just, yeah, I understand the argument. It's just from an explicit, what's the word that I'm looking for? Didactic standpoint of like somebody actually bringing and teaching. I don't see the language of expansion being used, like where he's saying, it's I mean, if anything, and I think it was you the last time and I promise I'm dwelling on the same argument that you're making, because I remember last week you alluded to Galatians 5:3, where Paul is saying from verse 1, therefore do not submit again to a yoke of bondage. I say to every one of you who would submit to circumcision is obligated or has an obligation to all that law.
That's
is
right,
how I read
precisely.
that.
Yeah,
And then if
that's what I brought up
and I
last
say
time.
again, I say again, if you allow yourselves to be circumcised, then you are severed from Christ. So one of the things that's there's only two options of being able to read of how to read Galatians 5:3. I think neither of those options, what's not on the table, at least from my vantage point, is the option that Paul is saying, well, if you allow yourselves to get circumcised and take that step, that's a burden that you won't be able to bear, because then you'll have to take on all the commandments of the law of Moses, and that's a burden that nobody can bear, so to speak. I'm sort of paraphrasing what maybe that argument would sound like. To me, that's off the table, because Paul then goes on in verses 12 and 13 to excoriate those who aren't loving their neighbor as themselves, because through this doctrine of circumcision, they're actually biting and devouring one another. And so why would Paul say that if you allow yourselves to be circumcised, you'll have to obey all the law? So don't do that, but go ahead and obey the law, because the law says to obey to love your neighbor as yourself, and thus to fulfill all the law. So it would seem to be, again, contradicting himself for him to be arguing that they shouldn't get circumcised because that obligates them to all the law of Moses. I think what's happening is these ones who are taking upon themselves this works of law, they're thinking that they can go and do that and not do the law. And Paul is saying, no, if even those of you who want to be circumcised, you're still obligated to the law of Moses. You can't shirk that aside and devour one another. You still need to love one another, and you're not doing that. In fact, boasting in your flesh like these people want you to is actually the way through which you are disobeying the commandments. So you need to stop doing works of law and start fulfilling the law. That's my reading of that whole pericope.
Right.
And I
So
don't
so
think your
Paul.
reading really stands through the section, because it would make Paul contradict himself.
Right, right. Thank you for that. I will. I mean, I would refer to chapter 4, verse 20, where he speaks about the law in its entirety a little bit more. I wish I could be present with you now and change my tone, for I am perplexed about you. Example of Hagar and Sarah. Tell me, who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law? For it is written, Abraham had two sons. It talks about the slavery of one aspect, being under the law as a slavery, and the free woman Sarah, and so forth. So he does give it a broader, more generic sense at that point. I was going to say, I forgot now. Yeah, so I would say that I would have to sorry reread Galatians. Just I'm sure there's other areas where he does. I think he's addressing circumcision because it was sort of prevalent. It was that the Jews were really focusing on that quite a bit. So he gives it a fair share of focus. He addresses it to a fair degree. So you're right. What you brought up there was a substantial sort of reference to it. But I think equally throughout the entire book, he does address the law in and of itself also, and just the antiquity of it, the archaic aspect of it, and the inefficacy of it as a whole. As a whole.
Hey,
Yeah.
Jared, I have a question. What do you think about?
Yeah, a quick. Oh, okay. Go
Okay.
ahead. Well, actually, I'll make one quick point. The sect, and you can pose your question. I just wanted to make one quick point, and I promise I won't be long. Um, with the midrash that Paul goes into in Galatians 4, starting in verse 22, and introduced with verse 21. Tell me, those wanting to be under law, do not listen to the law. Now, something that I think people need to pay closer attention to the rhetorical flow and the situation that Paul is speaking about here. I have laid out, and whether people disagree or agree, what I've laid out is that because Paul keeps bringing up this slavery thing, and he keeps turning the tables on people who want to bring this doctrine, and he's actually making them into slaves. These are people who are declaring that through this teaching, what they're presenting and what they're putting upon the Gentiles, they would be making the Gentiles into true sons. Like, that's their doctrine. This is how you become a true son of Abraham, is you become a proselyte and go through this circumcision process, and be like us. And they're saying that unless you do that, you will be as slaves. So you need to get circumcised and be sons. In other words, the only hope for you Gentiles is to either be a physical descendant of Abraham. Well, you're not that, because you're of the nation, and not of Israel. So the only way for you, the only hope, is to go through proselyte circumcision and go through this conversion process. Now, Paul flips the table on them, and he uses this midrash on Sarah and Hagar to do that. And it's important because they're going to Abraham. These people are not going to Moses to bring forth this doctrine to the Gentiles. And that's obvious because Paul keeps talking about Abraham, Abraham, Abraham. Paul does not bring up Moses once in this entire section, because the two covenants that are being made are with Abraham, one through Sarah and one through Hagar. So Moses is not in view. And I know you want to jump the gun and say, but he says Mount Sinai, Mount Sinai, Mount Sinai. I'll get to that. But I just want to say that there is no covenant at Sinai being established here. The covenant is with Abraham, and there's two covenants that that Abraham, in a sense, made, that two arrangements. He followed one through Sarah and one through Hagar. And so Paul is putting, whereas the agitators, they want to put themselves as the sons of promise, Paul actually places them as the sons of the slave woman. Why does he do that? Because they're appealing to Genesis 17, the instructions there to circumcise foreign bought slaves, to incorporate them into the household as household servants. They had to be circumcised. That's important because notice Paul is calling the children of the slave woman slave-born sons. They're not true sons, they're slaves. And so he's doing that very rhetorically, very polemically, to shake the Gentiles out of their desire to put this mark in their flesh and boast, therefore that these people could boast in them. It's like, wake up, people. These people are trying to make you slaves. They're not making you sons. You won't be of the son of the promise if you go through the circumcision process, because it's not in accordance with the promise. But if you remain faithful to Messiah, follow in his footsteps, walk according to the Spirit instead of trying to be perfected in flesh, then you'll be true sons, like your father Abraham, the father of faith. So that's what's going on here. No discussion about the law of Moses is happening in this midrash.
Interesting point.
The reason
Jared.
why,
Interesting point. Sorry, go on.
Yeah. No, I'll yield there. So,
Well,
sorry, the sect. Did you bring your question, or? Are you still there?
The sect, you go ahead.
I'm not sure if you.
Am I muted? Oh, there we go. I had a question for you, Jared.
Yeah, you're good.
What do you say to the circumcision? There is no law for adult circumcision, and that's what they were promoting. I mean, would you incorporate that into that argument?
It could be. I mean, it's just it. So, I mean, I think that does have a part to play. I mean, I think at the very least, Paul does not consider this circumcision a legitimate circumcision.
Right.
I think he actually invalidates it because it's circumcising to a certain degree, because it's circumcising adult males. But it's a little harder to drill down on that, because there are instances like Abraham himself was circumcised as an adult. Like there's certain people you can't escape that. They would have to be adults if they're to be obedient to Genesis 17.
But that was pretty much of their own free will, right?
Yeah.
Abraham and Moses both had it done, but it wasn't a commandment to have it done. Would you agree or
no? I mean, that's an interesting question.
It's just one of the ways I address it, because I believe that's what Paul is arguing here. That's why he says the circumcision by hands is not valid. And I mean, it's something that you need to want to do. You don't want to do the law. You want to be the law. You want to do it from the heart. But if these men are saying you need circumcised before you can get into the synagogues, that's what I thought Paul was basically railing against.
Yeah, I think there's some truth to that. There's a compulsion that's inherent to this doctrine, this circumcision party's doctrine, because like that compelling language, that verbiage that's prominent in chapter 2, where Paul says that not even Titus was compelled to be circumcised. There's a forcefulness, like you must do this. It wasn't like a voluntary thing. And in the same way, Peter, through his hypocrisy, was compelling Gentiles to become Jews. Basically, that's what Judaize essentially is, and it's tied to circumcision specifically. Taiwan, you've been waiting patiently a while, and welcome to the panel.
Hey, what's up?
what do you have to contribute? Hey, shalom.
Well, I see the title, but I just came in the room, so I guess I needed to be caught up to speed, see what you guys been talking about.
Yeah, so some of the exegetical questions that we've been exploring and asking are what does the term ergon nomu, works of law, mean in Paul's writings? What's it refer to? How does it relate to passages like Galatians 3:10 or verses Galatians 3:10 and 11 and 12? And what's his argument that he's been making?
Well, I think that he is referring to the Mosaic law in chapter 3. Is that what you're referring to, or that's what you're talking about? 3:10, yeah.
Yeah, actually, yeah. And we can go back to that.
The Torah, yeah. I think he was
Uh,
referring to the Torah.
yeah, and I don't know if you were here for my arguments or my comments earlier.
No.
I think the reason why I've found the Paul within Judaism scholarship in regards to this question of what works of law is has been the most accurate and one that I've landed on is because I've been through the traditional Protestant and Reformed paradigms on Paul and even the new perspective on Paul, and their take on works of law and the sort of rhetorical situation that Paul is doing. And I was not satisfied with either of them because they don't seem to take Paul's statements seriously that would lead to contradiction if in fact he says if works of law is in reference to the law of Moses. And in the first segment last Tuesday, what I brought forth and what I like to continue to go back to is putting these two verses side by side. Romans 2:13, it says, "For it is not the hearers of the law who are righteous before God, but it is the doers of the law who will be declared righteous." And that comes right after a explanation of those who, through seeking righteousness, good, and uprightness, and seeking the truth, will obtain eternal life and glory, whereas those who, and that pertains to both Jew and Gentile, first to the Jew and then to the Gentile, and likewise those who seek not the truth and seek after ungodliness and wickedness, they will receive wrath, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. And so it would seem to be, and then right after verse 13 and verse 14, he's describing Gentiles who have not Jewish regulations, but nonetheless they don't have that, and yet they're living according to the requirements of the law. And in fact, Paul uses that Gentile to then condemn or indict the Jew who has law, who has circumcision, and yet is a transgressor. So or sort of have that in forefront of your mind, and then go to Romans 3:20, the very next chapter. He says, "For by observing works of law shall no flesh be justified." Now, that's a blatant contradiction, A and not A, if works of law is referring to the law of Moses, because he already established in chapter 2 that is doing the law. It's by doing the law you shall be declared righteous, not just hearing it, not just having law and having circumcision, but actually doing the law is how you'll be justified, as his gospel declares. So when you get to 3:20 and he says that works of law, by works of law shall no flesh be justified, it just is a contradiction. And I don't see any way around that. I've heard arguments to the contrary, or people, or different ways to try to get out of that contradiction. But at the end of the day, it is, to me, it is a contradiction. What are your thoughts?
Well, Well, obviously, I disagree wholeheartedly with you.
Sure.
I just let me
That's fine.
because you said a lot of you said a lot of stuff. So I just want to kind of zero in and as you can tell from last night, I like word for word. So you gotta keep it simple with me. So kind of zero in and give me some specifics that I can respond to. Um, well, we can start right here since we're here already, and then we can go back to Galatians when get time. But let me address this first. I guess I can ask you exactly what do you exactly mean or understand about Romans chapter 2 verse. I'm not sure which one you said, verse 13. That you mentioned that, and then you also mentioned Romans chapter 3 verse 20. So very simply,
Yeah. Um,
what is your
mm,
premise about these?
mm. Okay. So reading in verse 13 here, for not the hearers of the law are righteous before God, but the doers of the law will be declared righteous. And just for clarity, that's dikaio. That's the dikaio root, justified, righteous. And we go to 3:20. And we see if yeah, okay. 3:20, therefore by works of the law. And if I've stated this before, but I'll say it again. You'll never hear me say works of the law because the phrase is ergon nomu. There's no the like definite article. It's not ergon to nomu. Like it's just ergon nomu, works of law. It says, therefore, by works of law, not any flesh will be justified before him. And then for through law is experience or knowledge of sin. So that's my basic thing. Romans 2:13, it is the doers of the law who will be declared righteous or justified. And then verse 20 in chapter 3, therefore by works of law, not any flesh will be justified before him. Can you work within this section to square that circle? I'm not saying that there's a contradiction, that he's contradicting himself, because I understand works of law to not be the law of Moses. I understand it to be human tradition, regulations that are outside the purview of the law of Moses.
Okay. All right. So, all right. Yeah. Let me see if I can square that circle as you put it. I think to understand verse 13, you have to read the preceding verses. First of all, verse 11. Let's just throw that in just for giggles. For there is no respect of persons with God. For as many as have sinned without law or outside of the law, in my understanding, that's the law of Moses. For as many as have sinned without
Understand?
law or outside of the law shall also perish without law. And as many as have sinned in the law shall be judged by the law. Again, I believe that's, according to my understanding, that's the law of Moses. So when you get to verse 13, it is in parentheses. Matter of fact, verse 13 is all the way in parentheses until you get to verse 16. But it says, for not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified. The emphasis is, if I can paraphrase, it's basically saying it doesn't matter if you're in the law or outside of the law. If you heard the law or if you didn't hear the law, it's the doers that are justified in the first place. So whether you heard it or didn't hear it or in it or out of it, doesn't matter. Paraphrasing again, it's those that do the law that shall be just or justified. And then again, in order to get the whole thing, you have to read 14 and 15. For when the Gentiles which do not have the law, they do by nature the things that's contained in the law, these, having not the law, are law unto themselves. Because why? Verse 15 explains it. Because they show the work of the law written in their hearts. Their conscience, con means with, And science is knowledge, conscience with knowledge. They do it also, their conscience rather, also bears witness, and their thoughts, meanwhile, accuse or else excuse one another. So if you read, once you read 12, 13, 14, and 15, you find that it doesn't matter if you heard the law or not. The Gentiles prove that you don't, the Gentiles prove that the hearing of the law is obsolete. It's a moot point because they show the work of the law written in their hearts already. It's a human thing, and I partly agree with you on that. That does it have to do I have to I guess a word I'm looking for, specify, or do I have to put emphasis on it, the fact that it's Moses' law? Not really, because the Gentiles, they didn't grow up with Moses' law, but they show the work of Moses' law. And particularly, I think it's the moral law, if you will. Thou shalt not do this and that. Exodus 20. They show the work of that written in their hearts already. So it doesn't matter whether they heard it or not. So the emphasis is the doing of it, the doing of the law. There is a righteousness that comes from keeping God's law. There is a righteousness that comes, a justification that comes from keeping his law. Problem is, I think what Paul is saying to us right here is that no one is able to do it. It's the doers that are justified. But who has done it? Who can do his law? Who can perfectly? The law is holy, just, and good, and perfect. It needs to be obeyed perfectly in order to obtain the justification or the righteousness that comes from keeping that law. Problem is, none of us are able to do it. And
Why?
So, say it again.
Why are not?
Let him finish. Let him finish his thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so again, none of us are able to keep that law that Paul is speaking of here, verse 13, 14, 15. And so when you get to verse 20 of chapter 3, it says, therefore, by the deeds of the law, again, I know you have your, the way that you word it or your understanding of it. I believe that is Moses' law, or the Torah, Therefore, by the deeds of the law, there shall no flesh be justified in his sight. For by the law is the knowledge of sin. In other words, God's law tells us what sin is. Thou shalt not do this, thou shalt do this, such and such. We've fallen short of that. Without question, we've fallen short of that. And so when you couple verse 20 of chapter 3 and verses 13, 14, 15, 12, you'll find that no one is able to obtain that righteousness or that justification that Paul is speaking of. But then, then I'll let you get this after this, but then when you read verse 21,
Sure.
you see that there is a righteousness that God, it says, but now the righteousness of God without or outside of the law is manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets. In verse 22, it even tells you right here, even the righteousness of God, which is by faith of Jesus Christ unto all and upon all that believe, for there is no difference. And so there is a righteousness that God is requiring. Now you can either get that righteousness from keeping the law, but you got to do it perfectly, or you do it by faith in Christ Jesus. So God is requiring righteousness, and so it's how you obtain it. But the law is there. It's a mirror. It shows us that we're incapable of keeping it, and we're incapable of obtaining that righteousness that comes from it. And so that's how I understand it. So,
Yeah, I mean that's a typical read. I'm not saying you're unreasonable and unsensible with your reading. You did a really good job of walking through things from your vantage point, and I followed perfectly. The one issue that I have is that if you could help me out here and point me to the specific place where Paul's conclusion is no one can do the law because it's impossible and you can't do it perfectly. Like that's sort of the conclusion that you're arriving at. And I want you to help me find in the text where Paul reasons from or comes to that conclusion. Because I didn't see it even in the passages that you were reading. So.
Well, I think, matter of fact, he uses, I think he even uses the word in Galatians, right, where it says we conclude um, all under sin, for all have transgressed the law. I think I'm just paraphrasing. Um, let's see.
Well,
Let me go.
I understand you've definitely got some other passages in mind. That's fair. But I mean, like what you read here in Romans
Oh,
2
in
and 3, what
particular.
you brought together, because it didn't seem like you were alluding to Galatians in your explanation. So I was trying to figure out where in Romans 2 and 3 you were coming to that conclusion, or seeing that Paul was reasoning from that conclusion.
Yeah, I kind of was kind of going off the top of my head and looking at the same time. So
Sure.
I was going off of memory. So you got to give me a moment to find it. I'm pretty sure it's there, but
Yeah,
um,
that's fair. That's fair. Yeah, I
yeah,
kind of put you on the spot with that. That's
it's all good.
um
Yeah,
yeah. Um,
justified. It might still be in the same chapter, but go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
let's see. Um, I mean that is to me the sticking point. Because I mean for me to get on board with that reading, like I mean I would have to, I mean, just for me personally, like I would have to see that in the passage. And one of the reasons why I land where I'm at now is because I could not find that anywhere.
Hmm.
I just can't see it, and people have tried to help me see it their way, and I have read it that way before, but I can't anymore. It's like because I'm just being honest, like I don't see it there anymore. Um,
Okay.
and because Paul seems to, not just seems, but Paul explicitly uses, you know, these Gentiles in chapter 2 that he's referring to that have the law written in their hearts. Like I mean that's new covenant. That's Jeremiah 31 language. I mean these are Gentiles who are in the new covenant, or at least they have or at least they have the down payment of the Spirit, because he says in verse 15 or verse 14, when Gentiles not having law. Now, what's this law that he's referencing? Well, we back up to verse 12, and you're right to start in verse 12 as opposed to 13. I'm glad you did. Um, and that's a really good point. For it says, for as many as have sinned anomia, like without law, will also perish without law. And as many as have sinned in law will be judged by law. Um, what law functions here rhetorically in this anarthrous grammatical in distinction from arthrous uses of nomu, like to nomu and ton noman, um, is, and that gets a little technical, but bear with me. Um, Law functions differently rhetorically than the law here, because Paul consistently describes throughout this chapter people who don't have law and yet are obeying the law, and people who have law and are disobeying the law. Um, and that's rhetorically and from a discourse level, like there's an inherent logic to that and a flow to that. Paul doesn't make this an a hypothetical judgment upon a Jew, by a Gentile who will stand at the judgment and condemn the Jew. That's not hypothetical. He's actually talking about a Gentile. These are Gentiles that Paul knows. Like this isn't a hypothetical Gentile. Paul knows these Gentiles because they are part of the community that he's raised up, and they have the law written in their hearts. They know the law because they don't have law. Law here is Jewish Pharisaic regulations. They don't have that. They don't operate in that because they've been raised in apostolic tradition to have the law written in their hearts. And so these ones who aren't circumcised, they will stand to condemn the circumcised one who actually is uncircumcised because of his disobedience to the law. Now he's boasting in law, which is the circumcision, but he's transgressing the law. That's 17 through 23 to 24, that whole section there.
Okay.
So what do
Can
you?
I? Can I?
Yeah,
Well, first of all, can I found those verses. It's still in chapter 3 of Romans. You see verse 9.
you were what's it? it called? You were dual you were double tasking. You were listening to me and you're so
Oh no, I was
sorry.
listening. I was listening as well. I wanted to find those verses and then respond to what you said um, just a moment ago as well too. But just to answer your question earlier, in verse 9, it says, "What then? Are we better than they?" In other words, is the Jew better than the Gentile? Paul says, "No, in no wise, by no means, obviously, for we have before proved, both Jews and Gentiles, that they are all under sin." And then he starts quoting, what is this, Psalms, I believe, "As it is written, there is none righteous," and so on and so forth. And so that's verse 10 all the way down to 18. So when you go to verse 19, he says, "Now we know that what things soever the law saith, it says to them who are under the law." Why? "So that every mouth may be stopped, and all the world may become guilty before God." And then obviously we read verse 20, "Therefore by the deeds of the law there shall no flesh be justified." So there you have it. The whole world is stopped. Everyone is guilty. No one seeks after God, so on and so forth. Um, and this is basically Paul saying the same thing that he said in Galatians. He's concluded that everybody's under sin. Everybody. It doesn't matter whether you keep the law, whether you observe it, everybody's concluded under it. And which is the reason why Christ died, right? Hey, we thus judge that if one died for all, then we're all dead, as Paul says. And he did die for all, which proves that all were dead. And so here you have it, both Jew and Gentile, you, me, anybody that we know, is all concluded under sin, because all have sinned and all fall short. And therefore we're all guilty. And yeah, that's and how we get that righteousness. What does Proverbs says? Riches profit not on the day of wrath, but righteousness delivers from death. And that's really the only thing that's going to deliver. But the question becomes, how are you going to get that righteousness? Because you're going to need it. But the question is how you're going to get it. So that's how I understand that.
Yeah, I have a question for Tywin.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you for that, by the way, Tyler.
Yes, sir.
You had stated that sin is transgression in the law, and that we're all in sin. If so, why does Messiah tell the guy that he healed at the healing well and the lady, go and sin no more? The woman caught in adultery, Messiah specifically tells them to go and sin no more after he does his judgment on the woman, but actually judgment on the Pharisees. But he also gives the healing to the man at the well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see an issue with him saying go sin no more. I mean, God hates sin, so it's not just because Christ died on the cross for sins doesn't mean that God lightened up and said, "All right, it's okay now." No, I mean, God is holy, and so He will always be against sin. He always hates sin because it's a direct attack on His character and who He is eternally. So.
Okay, well that's good, because the way you were saying that, I mistook you, because you were saying we're all in sin and we're still accepted by Messiah and everything, but we have to learn to not sin, correct?
Well, yeah, not to be justified, because, and let me explain that part just in case anyone disagrees with that. Not to be justified, because it's like if you run a stop sign or you run a light, you already broke that law, and the officer sees you. He's not going to let you rewind the clock back. He's not going to say, "Hey, okay, you can go back around the corner and do it again." Like, no, you've already broken it. You're going to get a ticket. And depending on how fast you were going, you might get locked up. So it's like there's no do-overs when you break a perfect holy law. There's no do-overs. I mean, even in natural law, even the law of the land, there's no do-overs. And so even with a perfect and holy God, even more so, right? So the righteousness that comes from that law doesn't matter. Now you can keep it and you can uphold it because Paul says that right here. Isn't it in the same? Is it in the same chapter where he says, "Do we do away with the law?" No, we establish the
Verse
law. We
31.
Amen.
yeah we establish.
Amen.
Yeah, we love the law because God's law is holy, perfect, righteous, just, good. And so, but we also understand that we've already broken this perfect law. So there's no justification that comes from keeping that law because you've already broke it, which is why
Wait,
verse which is why
isn't
verse go ahead, I'm
I'm
sorry.
sorry, but isn't that going
Oh,
against what you just said that it was righteous, just, and holy
No, it's
to
not.
to do?
The point that Paul is making is the righteousness that God is requiring. You cannot get that righteousness because you've already broken his holy law. It's a perfect law which needs to be obeyed perfectly in order for you to obtain the righteousness that comes from it, which is why Jesus Christ was the only mediator between God and man. That's why he's the only one that's able to do it because in him was found no sin or no guile. And so we, who he
Or
died
to
for,
emulate him? Do you believe that we're supposed to emulate Messiah?
absolutely. He says,
Okay.
"Why do you call me Lord and do not the things which I say?" I
Right.
understand,
yeah,
but
I think we're missing. I think if I may interject, what I'm seeing here is that the point of contention that Taiwan is bringing up is being missed. By your questions are good, but unfortunately, I think it's missing the contention that Taiwan is bringing or operating from, and so it's causing to talk past it a little bit, if I
yeah,
may. Um, because what you have stated, your contention, Taiwan, is that Paul's point is that the law requires a perfect standard, a sinless standard, and nobody can meet that standard. Hence, this is the reason for Messiah. Like that's like the
yeah,
basic bare bones premise. Now, to
absolutely.
that, and you may not have been here when I was reading this portion of this commentary. Uh,
Hmm.
uh, so this would be an exegetical commentary on Galatians by a gentleman named M. Cha,
Okay.
and so this is addressing this is his comments on Galatians 3:10.
Hmm.
Paul is not addressing obedience to the biblical commandments of God in Galatians 3:10, nor requiring flawless obedience to the law of God. In the larger context of Galatians 3, the apostle is contrasting two different systems of law. One that is man-made, based on works of the law or works of law, Pharisee, halakha, and falls under the covenant curses because of its inadequacy. And another, the law that is based on heart obedience to the biblical commandments of God recorded in Scripture. So what you presented is a traditional Christian interpretation. Again, it's sincere. There's some logic to it internally, but in contrast to that interpretation, David Stern rightly challenges the flawless compliance reading of Galatians 3:10. Uh, his comment follows. Despite the contrary opinion of many Christian interpreters, his point is not that an imperfect human nature is incapable of keeping all the commands of the Torah, for he neither says this nor proves it. Speaking of Paul, like he neither implies this nor is he trying to prove that. On the contrary, the Torah itself, anticipating. Sorry, I have to sort of zoom out and zoom in to get to the section here. That people fall short of complete obedience and thereby go out of fellowship with God. So the law itself states what those who disobey Torah commands must do in order to restore such fellowship. They must repent, and sometimes they must bring a prescribed sacrifice. So not only does the Torah expect disobedience and anticipates disobedience, but it makes explicit provision for it, mentioning sin offerings in 20 chapters of Exodus, because numbers in some 120 times in the Tanakh. Thus, according to Stern, the apostles' point in Galatians 3:10 is not that people are unable to obey the law of God perfectly, but that legalists in particular, merely by being legalists, violate at least one of the Torah's commandments, and therefore, on the basis of Deuteronomy 27:26, do not attain life, are not righteous, and come under a curse. Um, so this gets at the crux of why I titled this live stream, cursed if you do, or is it cursed if you don't? The traditional reading essentially is saying that God is telling his people, after having brought them out of slavery, brought them and making a covenant with them, to say, you must do this law, but if you try to do it, you're going to be cursed. So don't try to do it. You'll learn your lesson soon enough. I mean, you may not agree with that, but that's
No,
what's at the other side of the equal sign.
Can you repeat that part again? I'm sorry, just that part where you said you may not be able to do it. Can you repeat that again? I was listening, like maybe too closely to you.
Yeah.
Say that one more time.
Okay. Yeah. So what I'm saying is, essentially, what the traditional interpretation of Galatians 3:10 would be implying by entailment is that God had delivered his people out of slavery in Egypt to covenant with them and give them commandments and telling them that you must be careful to do these things, but don't try to do them, because the moment you try to do them, you're going to come under a curse because you can't do them. Like that is the God of the traditional interpretation. And I acknowledge that you would not say that. I just want to acknowledge that up front, that you would not say that.
Absolutely.
But that doesn't alleviate the fact that does not alleviate the fact that that's what's on the other side of the equal sign on the traditional reading. You may try to find some ways out of that, but that is the direct entailment of this reading of Galatians 3:10. And contrast to that, Deuteronomy is written with the perspective that God intends Israel to obey his laws and that she's able to do so. Hegg asserts, no one in Paul's day believed that anyone could live out Torah perfectly, and no teacher would have required such a thing. To abide in the things of the Torah meant living with the provisions of the Torah, including its provisions for what a person was to do when he or she sinned. Going on, the point that this commentator is making is that, in other words, to be of works of law is not equivalent to faithful heart obedience to God's law. It's apparently less than what the law of God requires. That's why in Galatians 6:13, that's why Paul says those who are of works of law don't themselves keep the law. Now they're doing something that they've erected as their own standard of righteousness, and thereby neglecting the righteousness of God, and they're not obeying the commandments. That's why they fall under the curse. But if you don't rely on works of law and instead walk in the obedience of faithfulness, then you are walking according to the things written in the book of the law, including the things in the book of the law that are prescribed if you do sin. We have an advocate, in other words. So how does that, do you see how that's a more reasonable, or do you see that as a more reasonable reading of Galatians 3:10?
Well, I might question it, that I would have said that Paul's talking about the hypocrisy, that even those who impose such a fastidious law upon you, they're not even capable of doing it themselves. I don't think he created a dichotomy there between two different laws. That's the way I've always understood it, Jared. That he's just talking about the hypocrisy, that double standard, where they travel across sea and think just to get one convert, or what is it? They strain out a gnat but swallow a camel. That sort of double standard, that hypocrisy about them. This is the way I would have interpreted the text you just referenced.
It would just, if I'm to be honest, it would, again, I think if we follow that equation and go to the other side of the equal sign, God rescued a people out of slavery, out of bondage, in order to put upon them an even greater bondage they could never get out from under. And that was the whole point, was to enslave them, and in a sense to say, we will do all that you have said, in response to the words that were declared from the mountain. And God is saying, that's great. And but secretly, um, this is another form of bondage that he's going to then have to deliver them from. And that's just it just really is a no-go for me. And I'm just being honest and forthright with that. It doesn't comport with anything that I find in the foundation, which is the Old Testament. You find nowhere that's even implied that God is saying, these commandments are going to be too hard for you, and you're going to learn your lesson, Israel, and hopefully be ready when I bring the Messiah into the world to deliver you from the law I just gave you. Like it is just outright disgusting to me, and to be
No,
honest.
right, but thank you for that. I don't believe that's argumentation. He's not calling the law a curse. He's saying due to the weakness of man, because the Israelites' contention with God was never, these are too difficult. The accusation was always, you're stiff-necked, you're prideful, you're arrogant. And this is what stopped them from doing it. They never complained it's just too hard. Because, like Moses said, the word is near you, it's in your heart. It's not hard to follow, so to speak. And Paul, and in Romans 7:24, where Paul is lamenting over the fact that his flesh is arousing him. He's not saying the law is a curse in that respect. It's just it's a struggle for mankind due to his own desires. I don't think anybody, David extolled the virtues of the law beyond more beautifully than any man could possibly do, and so forth. So nobody is calling the law in and of itself a curse. Paul is just saying that the human nature, that man's desires, man's constant disobedience, and I don't believe in total depravity either. But is that what makes us do it? So the law is beautiful, and Christ, the man who fulfills it, will have a beautiful character about him, like Jesus exuded. Like Jesus brought the real glory to the law. He fulfilled it. He brought glory to God's light. It wasn't too austere. It was not too austere. He fulfilled it. He indicted all of us. We should have been able to do it, but we didn't. Just from the hearts, our own hearts, nothing more than that. And he proved the beauty of it. He glorified it. And this is the reason why I felt God could justifiably abrogate it now. But that's another question altogether. So no one's calling the law a curse. It is beautiful. It's perfect. And the man who follows it will be a beautiful man, one who pleases God and wax strong both before God and man. Blah blah blah. But so yes, it's not. It's just Paul is lamenting the fact that the flesh rises them to do so, and the Jews themselves never said this is too hard. They were just stiff-necked. They were just rebellious. They were, idolatrous and everything else. And so I don't think the point is. I don't think you could have an argument that the law was too hard in and of itself. It was not. Christ.
Well, no, I don't agree with that either. I'm just
No,
saying I
of
think
course.
that's tailed by the view when it's logically worked out. But yeah, I understand. That's good. I appreciate your pushback on that. Taiwan, if you've got any further thoughts, first I want to say to Nanya Biz, you've been here for a while. Are you wanting to bring forth anything to the discussion?
Brother Jared, good to see you. I think that's the sect. Is that Dan? Taiwan, good to see you again. DB, I think I recognize. Yeah, just briefly. Just briefly. Yeah, good luck with that. I've had 5 extra sweet teas. My heart's pounding like a rabbit. I think there's as a Hebrew roots guy, I've seen 26 verses commonly debated in the New Testament, and from my outside third perspective, I don't want to say I laugh at both of them. I can see they're. I don't want to say they're both wrong. I can see where they're. I can see where they're both wrong, and this is what I'd like to bring to the table tonight to you, especially Jared. Oh my goodness, I watched. It was a 6-day-old video, but it was just put out today. I watched an hour of it. It was a 4.5-hour video, and you and Yahoo teach Yod Hey.
Teach Yahweh or teach Yahweh.
Yeah, we're speaking for 4.5 hours. I listened for an hour before somebody actually asked a question that was like, dude, did you hear what he just said? And you had to say, okay, let's go back to these scriptures that I first presented. You know what I mean? So I kind of hung up. But I saw you for 17
Yeah.
minutes giving the genius presentation on these scriptures that you guys are discussing. Genius. And I'm like, oh, he's going to preach exactly what I preach. And you were 99% there. And I got so disgruntled. But I think we're all missing a baseline of, there were two covenants at Mount Sinai. And the first was broke in less than 40 days, after 40 days. The second came much later. That's not up for discussion. It's, the Jews may say a couple weeks or something, but it had an added law. It had an added law just so that they could live because of the death penalty instituted at the golden calf. Remember, Moses broke the first covenant at the golden calf. God said, stand back, Moses. I want to kill them all as one man, disinherit them, blot out their name from heaven. At one point, he says, I want all their heads on a stake burning in the sun. Okay, but this added law was just so that they can live. In Deuteronomy, we see 3 different times. Do this law to live, do this law to live, do this law to live. And then quite frankly, in Deuteronomy, I don't even know, 30, let's say 36, because nobody's going to look it up. He says, long after the diaspora, he's talking to them way in the future, long after you've gotten the land and you've gotten fat, you've kicked, you've been dispersed long after the diaspora, I will circumcise your hearts so that you may live. So you have to do the law to live up until Jesus. Paul taught, so this is your baseline. So whenever Paul is talking law, or covenant, they're interchangeable. And it does mean the Mosaic law. So like Paul says, let's go to the law to answer all our questions. The law says only 8-day-old males. Only. Not 9, not 90. Oh, there's good. I know there's good examples of adult circumcision. Moses's kids were like 4 and whatever age, way over 8 days. There's good examples, but as far as following the law, it's only 8-day-old males, and the only repercussions in the New Testament, to me, the Hebrew roots would be that you cannot partake of the Passover. So this is why we see Paul discussing one guy eats meat, one guy only eats bitter herbs. It doesn't mean you can't partake of the Passover meal. It means you don't sit at the kiddie table. You sit at the adult. You just don't partake of the meat. You can eat the bitter herbs. Yeah. You can listen to the child say, "Why am I?" So if you're going to the new, so this every single time he says works of the law or works. This is Paul, not James. James's works are like Boy Scout good deeds works. Every time Paul in Galatians, Romans, it's circumcision, adult male circumcision, never required. And when he says they aren't doing all that it says in the law, he's referring to don't add or subtract from the law. These guys are adding to the law. In Deuteronomy 12:31, don't add or subtract from this law. Somewhere else, I heard somebody say Deuteronomy 4:2. I think it's 4:22. Don't add or subtract from this law. And Revelation 22, right before it says amen, it says, don't add or subtract from this book. They were adding fasting law. There was no fasting law in Torah. So when the Pharisees go to John the Baptist, say, hey, we go to Jesus and say, John the Baptist disciples fast on these days, we fast on these other days. How come you guys don't fast at all? He says, oh, they're going to fast when I'm gone, but that's because it's the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the only commanded fast. So if we're missing a baseline of what's going on, you're going to discuss what law means whenever Paul's talking about law. But works of the law, this is if we know Paul's routes in his first 3 years, he goes from Antioch to Antioch in Pisidia, quite frankly, and then east to Galatia, teaches them Jesus, comes back to Antioch. So the Galatians know Jesus. He's in Antioch, the Antioch that's just north of Jerusalem. And they come to him saying, no, Acts 15. So all of a sudden we get James saying the 4 and 4. do these 4 things, 4 Moses is preached every Sabbath. But we see what they wrote down was not 4 and 4. Well, it was just 4. Do these 4 things and it will go well for you. So immediately it's corrupted. But Paul goes back to Galatia and preaches to them. And at the beginning of the book of Galatians, he reiterates this. When I did go back there with those papers, you guys would have given me your own eyeballs. You were so happy. So this letter to the Galatians is long after this. The Pharisees have now gotten to the Galatians and saying, hey, Abraham was 99. Abraham was 80, Moses' kids. Hey, if you want to take part of the Passover. So if we don't understand this as a baseline, we're going to have 26 different verses constantly debated in the New Testament. Thanks for the airtime, Jared. You were so close in that video, and I spent so much time, I was done.
I can't cover everything. I'm going to miss something. I appreciate that. Yeah. I mean, there is so much more that I could say. I mean, for the benefit of those listening, I mean, I hope some of that, at least some of that connected, that there's a lot of context here that gives definition historically for the terms that Paul uses, and so we don't have to import ideas or invent definitions, and I think that's sometimes that's actually the starting point for Protestant and Reformed readings of Paul is they've inserted anachronistically their own concerns into the text and have redefined terms. Again, works of law comes from historically from sectarian community regulations. Not it just from its very inception is not a reference to the law of Moses. We have this as evidence in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Miksat Maaseh HaTorah inscriptions in these scrolls, and tying that to these will be reckoned to you as righteousness. Those are 2 phrases that are found in these documents multiple times, and Paul, and that's the forefront or the background for why Paul is using these terms ergon nomu and connecting them with righteousness of your own, as opposed to the righteousness revealed from heaven. So Paul's continually dichotomizing between the two because works of law adds and takes away from the law of Moses.
So
look at the 2 words look at the 2 words he's using, because in Deuteronomy 6:25, if you follow this law, it will be, that's your righteousness. But there's no justification, justified. There are some things the law cannot justify. Justified, just if I had never done it. Justified, never done it. There's nothing in that, because it was added for transgression. But what transgression? That transgression can never be justified by the law, because the law was added so that we could live. We had the death penalty at the calf. Do this law to live. It is your righteousness. That's what Paul's talking about. If you're under the law, you're going to have to do all of it. That's your righteousness. But these guys are crazy. These Pharisees guys with their law, it's craziness. So the justification. Look at those 2 words, righteousness and justified. Because he's saying specifically, those that live by the law will live by the law. That's what Deuteronomy says. But additionally,
well, Leviticus 18:5 says that the one who does them shall live in them.
Oh, and 3 times in Deuteronomy, somebody's got to Google that. Do this and you shall live. Do this and you shall live. Do this and you shall live. This isn't just live. This is live, like you were under the death penalty. But if you don't understand that, you're going to have to take it all the way back to Adam. Oh, Adam was the guy that gave us all imputed sin. No, Moses gave us all imputed sin by saying, don't come against your wives, instead of saying, don't come against the mountain. And additionally, writing down the 10 commandments and other things and putting it in blood. That was never commanded. That was our death penalty.
Honestly, you kind of lost me there at this point, because it seems like you're let me clarify something. Maybe I misheard you. Are you, when, for instance, we have the passages in Deuteronomy that says, if you're careful to do these things, they will be life to you. And in Leviticus 18:5, when it says, the one who does them, in other words, the commandments, shall live in them. And that's reiterated both by Paul and by Jesus when he answers the rich young ruler asking, what must I do to enter eternal life? And Jesus answers him, what are the commandments? And he lists them. And then he says, do these and you will live. So Jesus is going back to Leviticus 18:5. Are you reading that as a negative thing, like, or as a positive?
Well, I'm trying to point out the separation between the first covenant and second covenant at Sinai. The second had the added law just to live. You quoted a couple good things, but also man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word of God's mouth. And so we see this in Balaam when he 3 times at the festivals, the feast of 7 ox and 7 rams, 3 different occasions. When he goes and talks to God, we don't see the narrative of what God says to him. We just hear Balaam goes to God, and then he comes back and gives the narrative to Balak. I'm probably getting these names mixed up. So him speaking only the words of the Father, because he missed one word, if. God said to Balaam, if these guys come in the morning. And the text reads, and Balaam arose and went and searched these guys out. And God was angry with him and put an angel in his way. And it's like, why is he angry? And then you have to reread, oh, those people did not come. He said, if they come. The donkey, speaking only the words of the Father, is still the donkey, speaking only the words of the Father. There's a promised prophet that was spoken immediately when Moses went up there after it was too loud. After it was too loud, God said, these people have well spoken. I will raise them up a prophet. Why is he doing that right after the 10 commandments were shouted down? Because Moses had misspoke. And then he says, please repent, and God repented. But at Kadesh Barnea, the bad witness report, Moses went to him and said, please forgive them. And he says, I will forgive who I will forgive. Like you, I forgave you. You messed up just 1 year ago, by putting this in blood. God never commanded the blood. That's a death sentence to the breaker of the covenant.
Yeah, I'm not following all that, because I mean, I don't see that sort of reasoning. I'm not seeing that reasoning. That I guess what I'm saying is I don't see the biblical writers actually portraying those events as you are framing them. So that's interesting. I mean, maybe I'll go through and listen to this again. I appreciate you bringing that. I'm honestly a little bit confused about what you're saying about all that. So, but I appreciate you. Like I said, I'll go maybe listen to that again and see if I can make better heads or tails of that. Pray a little bit more before I listen in. So, but I appreciate you.
Got a question, Jared. So are you saying that in Galatians 3:10 that this is not the law of Moses, but like a general law or law in general? Is that what you're saying? Help me understand what you understand about Galatians 3:10.
Yeah. So works of law is in reference to, in this context, it's in reference to the sectarian regulation of circumcising Gentiles as proselytes to convert them into being Jewish, essentially in their flesh. I arrive at that because from the very first, after he gives his introduction in Galatians 1 and moves into Galatians 2, right off the bat, the thing that comes up immediately is the issue of Titus wasn't compelled to be circumcised. Moving on into the next little section, the confrontation at Antioch, Paul identifies the party that comes and he calls them the circumcision party. And then he immediately, right after that, mentions works of law. and then dichotomizes works of law with the faithfulness of Jesus, and and connects works of law with Gentiles being compelled to Judaize. Now, historically, I understand what the term iadizio as a verb to Judaize. In other words, there's nowhere in the Bible where you see the term Judaizer. Paul never identifies a Judaizer, but it does identify as Gentiles being compelled to Judaize. And in the Second Temple period, as as testified by both Josephus and Philo, who use this term, are in reference to people becoming Jews through proselyte circumcision. And it's in, so that sets the context, that that's fundamentally the issue. And then Paul links that with works of law. And I'm just drawing from scholarship regarding works of law that ties that phrase to sectarian halakhic rulings, regulations that would define a sectarian community, as evidenced in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that use these things to say, if you do these, it will be reckoned to you as righteousness. And when you peruse those community rules, those regulations, many of them actually oppose the commandments of the law of Moses. They actually go against the commandments of the law of Moses. But that's, again, what happens when you, as a sectarian group, and you're wanting to separate yourselves and make yourselves more distinct from a larger group, you're going to come up with things that go to the nth degree. And in doing that, you inevitably will depart from commandments in the law of Moses, and that's just what's happening. So I'm getting a little sidetracked, but let me bring it back to Galatians. This is what Paul identifies as law in this passage, anarthrously, not definite law, not the law, but law. And so when ergon nomu and law in Galatians 3 through this entire section is in reference to man-made regulations that are troubling the Gentiles and causing them to boast in flesh, causing them to devour one another, things of that nature. So when he gets to verse 10, for as many as are of works of law, they are under a curse, for it is written, curses everyone who does not continue in all things having been written in the book of the law to do them. As I argued before, the reason why being of works of law puts you under a curse is because works of law is something less than the requirements of the book of the law. It leads you away from those requirements into doing something different that actually transgresses the law, and that's what I see as the internal logic of this argument.
Okay, so basically you're saying that this is not the Mosaic law that he's referring to. I guess that's the question I'm want to get. You're saying that he's not referring to the Mosaic law, but when he says the works of the law,
right? Because he says in verses 11 and 12, the argument there is that that no one is justified before God in law, because the righteous will live out of faith. He's quoting Habakkuk 2:14, or is it 2:4? Sometimes I get that confused. It's one of those two. He's quoting that because in that context, living by faithfulness is keeping the words and doing righteousness, as opposed to the fool and the wicked who exalt themselves.
okay.
And so then the logic is, if it's being faithful that is righteousness, and this law, this works of law, is not out of faithfulness, then that means that this law doesn't justify. Rather, it's the one having done the commandments that will live in them. That's why he quotes Leviticus 18:5. So the internal logic here is that we know that works of law don't justify because they lead away from the law, and it's the law that justifies, because the one who does them shall live in them, and the righteous shall live by faithfulness.
Well, okay. So I just, yeah, I kind of figured that's what you were saying. I just needed to get more clarity on it, but
Mhm.
I disagree, obviously. So
Sure.
let me tell you why I disagree. Because first of all, in verse 10, he says, "Cursed is everyone who does not continue in all things written in the book of the law to do them." That is word for word Deuteronomy 27:26. So if Paul meant something different than the Torah, then I don't think he would have, quoted it explicitly, like he word for word verbatim, if he meant something different. Um, he, yeah, even in verse, what's that? In verse 17,
But
is that?
if I may, just real quick,
Mm.
but that's the reason why he does quote Deuteronomy 26 or 27:26 verbatim, is because works of law is not continuing in everything that's written in the book. That's literally why a curse is on them, is because works of law is not continuing in all the things written in the book of the law. It's not that you try to do some of the works of the law, but you can't do it. You can't do the law perfectly, and it pronounces a curse upon you because you can't do it perfectly. The internal logic is he quotes that verse because being of works of law is something other than doing the law. That's why that curse that's pronounced by the law is upon them, is because they don't continue. They do something else,
But don't you see
namely
how?
works of law.
Yeah, but don't you see how when you say that that creates confusion, it makes Paul seem to be confused as to what he is talking about or referring to, because
Not at all. I mean, I really don't. I mean, 11 and 12 makes it clear that the internal logic is a curse lies upon them because they're not walking in faithfulness, and they're not doing the commandments. They're doing something different, and therefore they won't live.
well, I figure you'd say that, but here's what the Bible teaches, though, right? Whether, and we just read it too in Romans. So whether you're in the law or heard the law or didn't hear the law or keep it or whatever, you were cursed or you are cursed whether you keep the law or not. That's why Christ came. He didn't just, he didn't die for those that keep the law and it's possible that they won't be cursed because they keep. Yeah, no, everyone's cursed. It doesn't matter who you are. So I think what you're premising is incorrect because it tends to kind of throw away everything that Paul is, the point that Paul is making all throughout Galatians, the book of the epistle to the Galatians. Um, we are under a curse whether we keep the law or the law works of law or the law of Moses or whatever law it is. Everyone's under a curse.
What's the curse, Taiwan? May I ask? What's the curse? Like why?
Why is the curse or what is the curse?
What justifies the curse? Is it because we don't fulfill it? Because it's just a curse by nature, by inherent
Well,
nature.
yeah, that's a combination of answers there. And Adam all die. One man brought sin into the world. So and we know these verses, we know these scriptures. So um, because, and I can paraphrase that, Adam represented us. I don't have to, I guess, go deep into that. We're all under sin. No one can perfectly keep God's law, or no one is perfect. Only God is perfect, right? So right there, even Jesus said it. Why do you call me good? None is good but God. Not implying that he's not good, but the point is, none is good but God. Even in Romans, it says there is none good, no, not one. No one seeks after God. So we're all under a curse, whether we like it or not, or whether we keep the law or not.
Due
Um,
to the fall of Adam, you mean? Due to the fall of Adam, we're under curse.
absolutely that part, but then we all have our own personal sins. We know we can't do it. I'm sorry, guys. There's the wife calling. I was waiting on that.
Oh, yeah.
Uh,
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Well,
Thank
and I'm going to have you go on here soon, but Yeah, thank you. So for the sake of Taiwan and moving forward, so I am going to have to end the stream. Probably we can have some closing thoughts, a little bit of back and forth for a few moments before we wrap up. I do want to say that next week, when we do it, what Taiwan brought up is maybe would be the next step in the ongoing discussion about this. We're still not completely. I don't think we still have complete understanding of each other's positions in regards to Galatians 3:10 and following. But what's brought up here is a particular traditional reading of Romans 3. Taiwan is at this point in the discussion, he's bringing up Galatians 3 and some passages there as a basis for his conclusion that Paul actually argues that no one can keep the law, and that's the basis for having to die to the law, and that works of law doesn't justify because we can't keep the law, and no one is righteous, no, not one. Sort of that thing. I think what would be a good thing to do is pick that up, because I don't agree with the traditional reading of that. Paul is not making a universal statement about human inability to please God or do anything good. That's the traditional reading, but he's actually the let's see, yeah, just a quick thought here. He opens up that pericope where he lists strings a bunch of passages in the Old Testament about there's no one righteous, not even one. He starts out with, what then? Are we Jews better? Not at all. Better than who? Better than Gentiles? Not at all, for we charge before both Jews and Greeks with being under sin, as it is written. Why does he say this? Again, this is a diatribe that he's engaged with an interlocutor, and that interlocutor has a ethnocentric attitude of superiority over Gentiles inherently. Like a Jew is inherently just more righteous because of circumcision than a Gentile. And Paul elicits a series of passages from the Old Testament that are indictments against rebellious people. They are not, in their context, universal statements of human inability to obey the law, or even a statement that no one has ever obeyed the law, because we have a plentitude of witnesses throughout the scriptures, both Old Testament and New, of people who obeyed the commandments and were blameless. And we have to take those seriously. What these are is a rhetorical polemic against the attitude of ethnic superiority, to say that it's not just Gentiles who are under sin. No, you Jew, you're under sin too. It's not a statement, because even in these passages, Paul juxtaposes the wicked with the righteous. So even when Paul says there is no one righteous, he's talking about not one of the people that he's referring to, not one of them is righteous, but then he goes on to describe the righteous. So we have to take these in context and say, and understand the argument is not an universal ontological statement about the human condition, but rather a polemic against a Jew, or a Gentile who has decided he is a Jew, that he has no better standing because of circumcision, even though circumcision has value, and that being a Jew has value because they're given the very oracles of God. Their wickedness does not, their standing as a Jew does not give them an out when it comes to being judged by God. And in fact, God has to judge the Jew first before he can judge the world. And that's the whole rhetorical flow of this. And ends with a discussion about God being the God of not just the circumcised, but also the uncircumcised, who both walk faithfully according to the law, not works of law. So that's a sort of a prelude to what we'll be getting into next time. I just wanted to put that forth as where we're at, sort of, and where we're going to go. next time. So any parting thoughts from you all, gentlemen?
I look forward to that. If you may, I'd like to sign out quick here.
Mhm.
I'd just like to say that there's so much of this debate of it always seems to be mostly centered around Paul, but you can be under the law or you could do the law and still not be considered justified. Basically, the law was given for justification for all, for his peoples to give you a role, and that you, when we get into the, you know, what did he mean at this point law? What did he mean at that point law? When he's saying you need to be more righteous than the Pharisees, it simply means they were quote unquote doing the law with their fences and everything else. They were still doing it, but there wasn't a justice there. They were denying the orphan and the widow, and there was no
Sure.
heart in it. And if people just look into what it is to have the heart for, it'll simplify those things for them. But yeah,
Um,
the law is actually easy for me. You know, don't eat this, don't eat that, try to do this, try to do that. It's the hard part is trying to be, you know, the servant, the one to take care of the orphan, the one to help the widows, the one to show brotherly kindness and love. That's the part that, you know, is hard to work on. The law is actually easy.
mhm.
So,
And
yeah,
I liken that as the distinction between the weighty matters of the law
yeah,
and the lesser matters of the law. It's not a categorization to where to say, oh, you know, these commandments. I'm not categorizing the commandments. I think the law of Moses is a whole. Is a one. There's a you don't split it up into different things. What I mean is that there are matters in every circumstance that become weighty in that circumstance, and they take jurisdictional precedence over lesser matters.
yeah,
And if you disregard the weightier matters to focus on the lesser matters, then it's as if you have broken the entire law. It's as if you hadn't even done the lesser things. You might as well have not done anything to begin with, and so that's why Jesus says you ought to have done the latter without neglecting the former. You can
yeah,
do the lesser things, but you shouldn't neglect the weighty things.
yeah. And I would just encourage all we are to be more righteous than the Pharisees, because I mean, Messiah calls them the fathers of the devil.
Yep.
So
Yep.
there's some improvement to be made there. But
Yes.
all right, yeah, that's all. I just wanted to mute out here, and then I look forward to Nunya Biz's exit.
Yeah.
What you
All right.
talking about, Willis?
Hey Willis, how you been, man? I missed you.
Oh, they finally took down all these fireworks stands in front of my apartment here, so it's beautiful. Now we got this deer out here getting they eat these berries and then they like pass out. So it's totally cool. It's I just love it. I love it.
Clean meat abound. No. All right, fellas. Shalom, shalom.
Shalom.
Yeah, I think that I'll be quick. I think that what he's quoting, there is none righteous, no, not one, is a time when David was speaking about the priesthood that was supposed to teach, but now we have Jesus, so we'd have no Levitical priesthood system. So now we all know who he is. Our Jeremiah 31:31 prophecy, I will write the law on your heart. He doesn't say I'll write the covenant on your heart. This is because there was a covenant plus law at Mount Sinai, thank goodness, so that every last seed of Abraham could live. Otherwise, he was going to start over with Moses. And Moses, being the most humble man in the world, is because he said no. Everything God had to go through Abraham could have gone through Moses, and he said no. That's why he's the most humble man in the world. These atheists say, oh no, if he's the most humble man in the world, why did he write down I'm the most humble man? He was the most
Right.
Yeah. Thank you. Because he gave okay. Yeah, sorry. I just
No, it's fine. It's fine. Yeah.
Jared, we got to talk sometime. It's so
Yeah,
simple.
we do.
You take 10 minutes to say it's circumcision when all you have to say is it's adult. The law says 8-day olds. Every time he says law, it's Mosaic law. The brother that was speaking saying he's confused over why are you saying the works of the law is bad, but that word within your own words of saying works of the law, that's the Mosaic law, which is good. How can that be? That's his confusion. It's because the works of the law are 8-day old males, and the audience in Acts 15. What are they, 7 days old? Hey, tomorrow tomorrow when you get circumcised, boys, it's going to be for salvation. You're going to have to get no, these are adults. So no, I just love the newfound freedom I have found in your
Mm-hmm.
channel, and 13 above, and the whatever the girl's name is, the teach. Oh my gosh, she said something logical the other day that was so cool. But I disagree with. But it's like, dude, I'm not going to debate her. She wins.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah, true. I like I like Freddie's panels when I'm able to catch them.
Yeah, Jared, thank you very much. Had a great time, very educational. We did disagree on a few points, but all the same is extremely edifying. Thank you so much for that. I guess, right, what can I say, just to sum up everything? I'd rather be under the law of grace than the law of works. And whatever that's worth right now, I don't know. And I still have a problem just with the exegesis, the hermeneutics on what you're proposing there, as I've already stated. So nothing new. Jared, thank you very much. I'll probably see you next week. Thank you.
Give me a couple more Tuesdays and you'll come around. No, I'm just kidding.
Who knows? Absolutely. We'll see. Appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, DB.
Thank you.
All right. We just passed the 3 hour mark. I think that's a wrap. Let's close this out, remove that, come back to here. Let's see. Yep. All right. Thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for for enjoying and spending this Torah Tuesday with us. Look forward to next week's Torah Tuesday. So I don't know how many Tuesdays we're going to be doing it. It's sort of something that that I've committed to for a little while as I'm able to. So we'll see. But shalom to everyone. Have a wonderful night. God bless you. Hey folks, if you enjoyed this episode and the content, please like the video and leave a comment below, and definitely subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you can be sure to catch more content like this as it comes. Until next time, think deep.